There is a moment in late February of 1944 when the world tilts towards silence. A thin road carved through pine forest near a place called Milyatin in the Ukrainian countryside becomes the precise center of an enormous question that no one will ever fully answer. The snow that morning lies in that peculiar way it does after a night of heavy fall, thick and muffling, transforming sound itself into something distant and soft, as though the forest floor has been padded with felt. The trees stand very still, their branches carry weight. Somewhere in that whitened quiet, an open car moves along the forest road, and inside that car sits a man whose name will echo through military histories for decades to come, a man whose death will become a riddle wrapped in political silence and competing narratives that have never quite resolved themselves even now, in our own time. This is the story of that moment, and of the man who came to it, and of all the long years that led him there. His name was Nikolai Alexandrovich Vatutin. He was one of the Soviet Union's greatest military commanders during the Second World War. And on this particular morning, moving through that snow-hushed forest in a car with several aides, he would experience something that few soldiers of his stature ever face: an attack from those he believed to be on his own side. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? The real understanding of what happened that day, and why, and how it came to pass at all, requires us to step back much further, to the beginning, not to the ambush itself, but to the man, to his rise, to the world into which he was born, and to the slow accretion of choices and chances and terrible circumstances that brought him to that forest road on that particular morning. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden stories of the Second World War, to the untold histories of commanders who shaped the Eastern Front, and to the complex and often heartbreaking fates of those who served with brilliance in impossible circumstances, I invite you to subscribe to this series. We will be walking together through the complete life and death of Marshal Nikolai Vatutin, exploring not just the battles he won and the strategies he devised, but the world he inhabited, the men who knew him, and the enduring mystery of how one of the Soviet Union's most capable generals came to die in shadow, his death shrouded in questions that have never fully been laid to rest. The forest is very quiet now. The mist rises from the snow in thin wisps, moving slowly upward through the dark trunks of the pines. There is a quality to this particular landscape that seems removed from war altogether, something almost timeless about it, as though the forest itself exists in some other dimension, untouched by history and conflict. And yet the forest of 1944 Ukraine was anything but untouched. Every tree, every clearing, every curve of that forest road carried significance. The war had moved across this land like a wave. The Germans had been here. The Soviets had driven them back. But beneath the official movements of armies, another war was being fought, a war of partisans and nationalists and competing visions of what Ukraine should become. The car carrying General Vatutin moves through this landscape in the early hours of the morning, when the light is still muted and the day has not yet fully announced itself. The snow continues to fall, very lightly now, adding new silence to the silence that is already there. In a moment that no one can predict, in a moment that seems to come out of nowhere, the forest will come alive with violence. The sound of small arms fire will shatter the white quietness. Men will shout. The car will come to a halt. And Nikolai Vatutin, a man who has commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who has directed the movement of armies across vast stretches of the Eastern Front, who has sat in headquarters and planned offensives that have changed the course of the war itself, this man will be wounded by the very country he has served. But we have not arrived at that moment yet. We are still in the approach, in the breathing space before the story truly begins. Let us linger here in the quiet, in the mist, in the gentle accumulation of snow on pine boughs, and begin to understand how a life of such significance came to its ending on a forest road, and why the question of that ending would persist long after the war itself had moved into history. There is a story within this story, a mystery that has never quite been solved, and it rests at the heart of what you are about to hear. On the 29th of February 1944, a Soviet general was shot and wounded by men who were fighting under the red flag he had served, and in the fog of that winter afternoon, near a small village called Milyatin, the question of who truly pulled the trigger and why would linger in the Soviet archives for decades to come. This was not a glorious death on a battlefield swept by artillery fire. This was something else entirely, something quieter, more uncertain, and perhaps more tragic for that uncertainty alone. Nikolai Alexandrovich Vatutin was no mere regimental commander or staff officer shuffled between postings. By the winter of 1944, he had become one of the Red Army's most celebrated generals, a man whose name was whispered with respect in the corridors of the Kremlin, a strategist whose fingerprints were visible across some of the most decisive operations of the war on the Eastern Front. And yet on that February afternoon, he fell not to German bullets, but to shots fired by Soviet partisans, or so the official story told. The ambush itself was never fully explained. The perpetrators were never clearly identified, and the manner of his death, the precise trajectory of events that led him to that particular forest road at that particular moment, would remain clouded by official silence and by the natural fog that accumulates around sensitive truths in a totalitarian state. Perhaps you have wondered, in the quiet hours of the evening, what it means when a man is killed by those who claim to fight on his own side. Perhaps you have felt the strange unease that settles over history when the official version of events seems to shimmer slightly out of focus, when there are gaps where there should be clarity, when the machinery of state remembrance seems deliberately to look away. This is that story. This is the biography of a man who rose from peasant roots in the Russian heartland to command armies of millions, who won battles that shaped the course of the Second World War, and who died in a manner that was never entirely his own. If you find yourself drawn to the lives of soldiers caught between historical forces larger than themselves, to the intricate machinery of Soviet command during its most crucial hours, and to the lingering mysteries that surround the deaths of those who served an empire that often erased its own servants from memory, we invite you to subscribe as we unfold this journey together. This is not merely a military history, though it is that. It is a portrait of a man navigating the depths of the 20th century, and a meditation on loyalty, betrayal, and the obscure spaces where history waits to be understood. To know Nikolai Vatutin is to know something essential about the Soviet Union at war, and about the human beings whose choices and sacrifices, and whose fates, shaped the world we inhabit now. And so we begin not with his death, but with his beginning, with a landscape and a moment in time before the great upheavals came, before the revolutions and the wars and the strange, shadowed end that awaited him. Let us travel backward, then, to a Russia that existed before the Soviet Union rose to transform it, to a country village where a boy was born who would one day command fronts, lead armies, and fall to wounds that would never be entirely explained. In the quiet darkness of this moment, we turn our attention to that distant beginning, to the time before the cold and the snow took on their terrible meaning, to the Russia of a century ago, and to the modest but determined life from which one remarkable military mind would emerge. Picture the landscape of the Russian Empire in the final years before its unraveling, when electricity had not yet reached most villages, when the sounds of the countryside were still the sounds that had echoed for centuries. The creak of wooden carts, the lowing of cattle at dusk, the whisper of wind through wheat fields, stretching toward horizons that seemed to contain the whole world. It is from this quietness, this rhythm of seasons turning in an ancient pattern, that we must begin, if we are to understand the man who would one day command armies across the scorched earth of southern Russia. The year was 1901. Queen Victoria still reigned in distant London. The 20th century had only just begun, arriving without fanfare, without the clamour of machines that would soon tear through the continent. And in the vast central region of Russia known as the Black Earth, in the province of Kursk, where the soil itself seemed to promise perpetual abundance, a child was born into the kind of obscurity that was the inheritance of millions. The Kursk countryside in those years existed in a sort of temporal suspension. Modern Europe, with its railways and factories, felt very far away indeed. Here, the rhythms were those of agriculture and orthodox tradition, of harvest and famine, of faith worn into the bones of villages that had persisted for generations without name or notice in any chronicle of the world. The gentry lived in their manor houses, distant and largely absent, their power rendered partly abstract by emancipation, but still felt in the texture of everyday life. The peasants tilled their strips of land, paid their taxes in kind and coin, and looked to the church and the Tsar as the twin pillars upon which their existence rested. And it was into a family of some modest means and education that Nikolai Vatutin entered this vast, slumbering realm. His father was a minor official, a man of the middling ranks of imperial service, the sort of figure who possessed enough literacy and authority to occupy a role above the peasantry, but without the grand estates or connections that might have secured him prominence. These were the invisible bones of the Russian Empire, clerks and minor functionaries who kept the machinery of bureaucracy turning, who existed in a peculiar liminal space between the nobility above and the vast masses below. The household into which young Nikolai was born would have possessed certain advantages, certain windows into a larger world. There would have been books, perhaps, and the expectation that a boy of such parentage should acquire education, should learn to read, not merely prayers, but also the literature of Russia itself. Yet simultaneously, this was still a world of extreme closeness to the land, of seasons that dictated the rhythm of all human activity, of winters so severe that they pressed down upon the imagination like a physical weight, leaving long months when the world seemed to contract to the size of a village and a handful of buildings. What of the personality that took shape within these circumstances during these formative years at the threshold of a new century? We cannot know with certainty the interior life of a child we have lost to time. Yet those who would later serve under him, who would study his methods, would speak again and again of a quality that seemed fundamental to his character, a methodical nature, a patience with detail, a disinclination toward flights of fancy or improvisation. Some of these qualities, perhaps, were born from this very landscape, from a peasant culture that had learned over centuries that success depended upon regularity and care, upon understanding that the soil would yield only to those who worked it without haste and without deviation from what experience had proven effective. The Russian Empire at this moment was perhaps at the last point before catastrophe, when it still possessed the illusion of stability. The Tsar reigned from his distant palaces. The Orthodox Church sanctified the social order. The peasantry, though discontent and sometimes rebellious, had not yet discovered its collective force. The educated classes debated philosophy and literature in salons, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. It was an empire that seemed to stretch into infinity in all directions, an expanse of land so vast that it had always seemed immune to the fragmentation that had visited other kingdoms. Yet even in the depths of the countryside, even in a small village of the Kursk region, where a minor official's son was learning his letters and his prayers, there were tremors of something larger taking shape. The railway had recently extended its iron fingers into these regions, and with it came ideas about workers and their rights, about change and justice, about the possibility that the old order might not endure forever. Newspapers, still a luxury, carried accounts of strikes in distant cities, of political movements that seemed impossible, unthinkable, yet which persisted in growing beneath the surface of official life. But these were distant concerns. In the villages, life continued as it had. Children learned to help with the harvest. Families gathered around tables for meals of bread and soup and whatever the season provided. The church bells marked the passage of days according to the Orthodox calendar, which divided the year into cycles of fast and feast that had been observed in this same landscape for 1,000 years. It is from this world, this mixture of agricultural calm and underlying uncertainty, that Nikolai Vatutin emerged, a boy with the advantages of modest education, shaped by a culture that valued order and method, standing at a point in history where everything was about to transform, though no one could have known it then. The quietness of this childhood, the routine of rural life, the discipline of a provincial education, these would become, perhaps, the very qualities that would allow him to navigate the storms that were already gathering on the horizon, waiting only for a moment to break forth and sweep away the Russia he knew. The Chepukino village where Nikolai Vatutin arrived as a newborn in the spring of 1901 was a modest knot of timber houses gathered along a quiet tributary of the Klyazma River, not far from the small town of Skopin in Ryazan province. The building where he would spend his earliest years was neither grand nor unusual. A wooden structure with a steeply pitched roof designed to shed the accumulating snow of the Russian winter, standing among other similar dwellings in a landscape of birch and pine that stretched endlessly toward horizons broken only by the distant spire of the village church. His father, Alexander Alexandrovich Vatutin, was a military man of modest rank and modest means, a cavalry officer whose service to the Tsar had earned him a small estate and the steady income that came with a professional commission. His mother, Yevgenia Ivanovna, came from a family of landowners whose circumstances had grown increasingly precarious in the waning years of the 19th century, as the old agricultural order of the Russian Empire began its long, almost imperceptible slide toward collapse. To speak of Vatutin's childhood is to speak of a world that already sensed its own ending, though the end would not come for another 16 years. The great estates of the nobility still stood, the Orthodox churches still held their festivals, the seasons still turned in their ancient rhythms. Yet there were stirrings, intellectual currents from Moscow and Petersburg, rumors of unrest in the factories of the industrial towns, whispers among educated Russians about reform and modernization, and the question of whether the Tsar's absolute authority could long survive the 20th century that was just beginning. For a boy born into the educated military class, as Nikolai was, these currents were distant things. His father's world was one of regimentation, hierarchy, the clarity of command and obedience. The home itself was orderly, disciplined. There is little surviving record of Vatutin's earliest childhood. The documents from these years are fragmentary, the personal accounts almost non-existent, but the outlines can be discerned from the structure of his father's life and from the patterns that would emerge so clearly in Nikolai's character throughout his later existence. Alexander Vatutin was a man of the old Russian officer corps, formed in the traditions of the Imperial Military Academy, accustomed to seeing the world as a hierarchy of responsibilities and obligations. He believed in duty, in the cultivation of mind through study, in the subordination of personal desire to the demands of service. These were not unusual values among the Russian military gentry, but they appear to have been held with particular firmness in the Vatutin household. What emerges from the scattered biographical fragments is a picture of a father who valued discipline and intellectual achievement, who encouraged his son towards serious study and the development of a structured, logical mind. The Russian educational tradition of this period, especially among the military class, placed great emphasis on mathematics, on languages, on the mastery of systematic knowledge. A boy was expected to demonstrate promise early, to show signs of the seriousness and focus that would mark him as suitable for advancement through the institutions of state service. By the time Nikolai was old enough to begin his formal schooling, likely around the age of 7 or 8, as was customary for boys of his social standing, he had already absorbed something of his father's orderliness. The photographs that would later be taken of him, even in his youth, reveal a gravity in his expression, an almost solemn attentiveness to the world around him. One might wonder whether this seriousness came naturally to the boy, or whether it was cultivated by the expectations of his environment, by the presence of a father who modeled discipline, by the silent pressures of a household that valued achievement and restraint. The truth, almost certainly, lies in some combination of both. Temperament meeting expectation, nature working in concert with nurture to shape the person that Nikolai Vatutin would become. He was sent to school in Skopin, the nearby town, likely boarding with relatives or in a school dormitory during the week, and returning to Chepokino for holidays. The school itself, its records have largely vanished, as has so much of the paper trail of the imperial period, was probably one of the classical gymnasiums that had been established in towns across the Russian Empire to provide secondary education to the sons of officers, landowners, and successful merchants. These schools followed a standard curriculum: Russian language and literature, mathematics, history, geography, the classical languages of Latin and Greek for the more advanced students, French and German as practical languages of European culture. The teaching methods were formal, structured, relying heavily on memorization and recitation. A student was expected to master the assigned material, to demonstrate his mastery through written examinations and oral recitations, to accept the authority of his teachers and the curriculum without question. There was little room for individual creativity or personal preference. The point was to fill the mind with useful knowledge and to develop habits of discipline and serious thought. In this environment, Nikolai Vatutin appears to have thrived. The fragmentary evidence suggests that he was a diligent student, perhaps not always the most brilliant or the most imaginative, but steady, reliable, thorough. He excelled in mathematics, a subject that appeals to the orderly mind, that rewards precision and logical thinking. He showed aptitude in languages. He was, by all available accounts, the kind of student who consistently performed well because he understood what was expected of him and applied himself consistently to meeting those expectations. This is not to suggest that he was merely mechanical in his approach, merely rote in his learning. Rather, it appears that he had found in the structured world of serious study something that suited the fundamental character of his mind, a framework within which he could exercise both discipline and intellect, in which hard work and careful thinking yielded measurable results. The village of Chepokino itself, the place where he spent his holidays and where his family maintained its small estate, was the background to this childhood, though perhaps not the primary shaper of it. Rural Russia in the early 20th century was still, in many ways, medieval in its social organization. The peasants who worked the land surrounding the village lived in conditions of crushing poverty, bound to the soil and to the landowners by ties that had evolved from serfdom but had not fundamentally transformed since its official abolition in 1861. The gap between the lives of the rural peasantry and the lives of the educated gentry was immense, almost unbridgeable. A boy like Nikolai Vatutin, growing up in his family's modest but comfortable house, attended by servants, educated in languages and mathematics, would have been aware of this gulf without necessarily being troubled by it. This was the natural order of the world, or so it appeared. The peasants had their place and their duties, the gentry had theirs. God had ordained it so, or so the Orthodox Church taught. Only the most radical intellectuals of the time, and they were few, questioned whether this arrangement might not endure indefinitely. Yet there was something in Vatutin's early experiences, perhaps, that set him apart from the pure aristocrat or the idle gentleman. His father's military career, his emphasis on service and duty, on the mastery of practical knowledge and skills, these things inclined Nikolai toward a view of the world that was somewhat more functional, somewhat more oriented toward achievement and capability than toward inherited privilege. The officer corps of the Russian Empire, even in its most tradition-bound aspects, valued competence. A man rose through the ranks based on his demonstrated ability, his education, his capacity to command and to think strategically. This was not a democratic principle, certainly. The aristocracy still dominated the higher reaches of the military hierarchy, but it introduced an element of meritocracy that was not present in the civilian aristocracy. A talented young man of modest family, with the right education and the right connections, could advance further in the military than he might in other fields of service. This may have been something his father understood and valued. And Nikolai, in his own way, appears to have absorbed this lesson early, that advancement came through discipline, through serious study, through the development of capability. There are no surviving personal recollections from Vatutin himself about his childhood, no letters or memoirs in which he reflected on his early years. This absence is itself instructive. Even among the Russian officer corps of this period, it was not uncommon for educated men to preserve some record of their inner lives, their formative experiences, their sense of how they had come to be who they were. The fact that no such record exists for Vatutin suggests a man who kept his personal life strictly separate from his professional identity, who did not dwell on his past or see it as particularly relevant to the present. This quality of restraint, of focus on the task at hand rather than on introspection or self-analysis, would characterize him throughout his life. He was not a man given to psychological self-examination or to elaborate emotional expression. He was a man who worked, who studied, who fulfilled his duties, and who expected others to do the same. By the time Nikolai reached his late teenage years, in the opening years of the 20th century, he had absorbed the fundamental lessons of his upbringing, that order and discipline were virtues, that hard work and serious study yielded advancement, that the world had a proper structure, and that one's duty was to understand one's place within it, and to execute one's responsibilities with precision and care. He was not yet politically conscious, or if he was, there is no record of it. The revolutionary ideas that were beginning to circulate among younger Russians, the socialist theories and the anarchist critiques of the imperial system, appear not to have touched him. His mind was oriented toward practical matters, toward the mastery of knowledge and skill within the established frameworks of the imperial educational system. The great upheavals that were approaching, the wars, the revolutions, the transformation of all the old certainties, were still beyond the horizon of his awareness. For now, he remained what he had been shaped to become, a disciplined, serious young man, marked by the orderly world of his childhood, ready to pursue his education further and to follow his father into the world of military service that had defined his family's position and prospects for generations. The world that young Nikolai inhabited in those early years of the 20th century was one suspended between two ages, caught in the long twilight before the old certainties collapsed entirely. The Russian Empire still sprawled across its vast territories in 1914, when the boy was 13, living in the small world of Chepukino and the Kursk countryside that seemed almost sealed off from the great currents moving through Europe. Yet even in such distant rural places, even in the quiet rhythms of provincial schooling and family routine, the distant tremors of history began to be felt. When the Great War came in August of that year, It arrived first as news, carried by travelers and newspapers, whispered in marketplaces and schoolyards. The enormity of it could scarcely be grasped by a boy still occupying himself with his studies and the small hierarchies of school life. Yet something in the air had changed. Distant relatives, neighbors, men from nearby villages began to disappear into the army. The casualty lists began to grow, month by month, year by year, and with each passing season the war revealed itself not as a quick settling of diplomatic disputes, but as something far more terrible, a grinding, insatiable machinery that demanded sacrifice on a scale that Russia had never before witnessed. For Vatutin and his contemporaries, those born in the first years after 1900, the war became a shaping force almost from afar. It transformed the economic textures of the countryside. It altered the relationship between Moscow and the villages. It introduced a sense of precariousness, of the fragility of the old order, even to those who lived far from the trenches. And it created, whether consciously or not, a hunger for a different kind of future, for something other than the hierarchies and certainties that had governed Russia for centuries. Then came 1917, and the world fractured entirely. The revolution arrived in Russia's great cities first, as all things did. In Petrograd and Moscow, in February and October of that year, the old regime fell away like a structure collapsing from within, and a new ideology, radical, uncompromising, utterly transformative, began to reshape the very language of politics and power. For people living in distant provinces like Kursk, the experience of 1917 was necessarily different from that of the urban centers where history visibly convulsed. Yet the revolution was not a distant event, even in the countryside. It was a rupture that spread outward in waves, each one carrying the possibility of upheaval and transformation. One might imagine the confusion, the uncertainty, that such a moment would produce in the mind of a young man of 15 or 16 years old. The world he had known, the assumptions that had structured his childhood, were suddenly revealed to be fragile, contingent, subject to overthrow. The empire that had seemed eternal was dissolving. The Tsar, who had loomed as an almost mythical figure in the political imagination of Russia, had abdicated and would soon be executed, along with his entire family. Everything that had seemed fixed was suddenly rendered mutable. For a boy of Vatutin's temperament, disciplined, orderly, thoughtful, such upheaval must have presented a profound challenge. How does one construct a sense of purpose and direction when the very foundations upon which such purpose might rest have been violently removed? How does one imagine a future when the past has been declared null and void, when the institutions that had governed life for generations have been swept away? Yet there was something in the revolutionary moment that also opened possibilities, that offered a kind of liberation to those willing to imagine it. The old hierarchies of birth and family connection, the rigid class structures of the Russian Empire, the assumption that one's life was determined by the circumstances of one's birth, all of these were, at least in theory, swept away by the revolution's radical egalitarianism. A peasant's son could become a general. A young man of humble origins could imagine a role in the construction of an entirely new society. The old certainties were gone, yes, but so too were the old limitations. The civil war that followed the October Revolution transformed this theoretical liberation into something far more material and immediate. Between 1918 and 1922, Russia tore itself apart in a struggle between the red forces of the Bolsheviks and the white armies arrayed against them, supported by foreign powers both European and Japanese. This was not a distant conflict, something to be read about in newspapers. It was a reality that touched the countryside directly, that demanded choices of all who lived through it, that rendered survival itself uncertain. In the provinces of central and western Russia, including the Kursk region, where Vatutin was coming of age, The Civil War was not a single clear struggle, but a complex, shifting reality of competing factions, uncertain allegiances, and waves of violence moving back and forth across the landscape. Red armies and white armies swept through the countryside in succession. Local populations found themselves required to feed armies, to supply weapons, to support one side or the other, often without any genuine choice in the matter. Villages were occupied and then liberated and then occupied again. Men were conscripted by whichever force controlled the territory at any given moment. For a young man of education and obvious capability, of the sort that Vatutin had demonstrated through his schooling, the Civil War presented a particular kind of opportunity, albeit one shadowed by danger. The Red Army, in those early years, was desperately in need of officers who could read and write, who possessed some rudimentary education and capacity for organization. The old Imperial Officer Corps had, for the most part, either fled the country or been eliminated. Their places had to be filled by new men, drawn from the educated classes who had thrown in their lot with the revolution, or who had simply found themselves conscripted into its service. It was in these years, as the century's second decade was drawing to a close, that Nikolai Vatutin made the choice, or perhaps experienced the compulsion that would define the remainder of his life. The collapsing world of the Russian Empire, the revolutionary upheaval that had unmade the old state, the terrible machinery of the Civil War that ground across the countryside, all of these forces converged upon a young man of 17 or 18 years old and drew him, inexorably, toward the Red Army and the militarization of his already disciplined character. Consider, if you will, the interior life of such a moment. A young man stands at a threshold, caught between the old world he has known and a new one that is being violently constructed all around him. The future offers no certainties, only possibilities and perils in nearly equal measure. The world of rural routine and provincial schooling that had bounded his earlier life is suddenly opened into something far vaster, far more consequential. Whatever hesitations he might have harbored, whatever doubts about the ideological claims of the revolution, Vatutin possessed the qualities that the new Soviet state desperately required: discipline, intelligence, a capacity for methodical thinking, and perhaps most crucially, a willingness to serve something larger than himself. The path forward, though obscure, had begun to reveal itself. The world Nikolai Vatutin entered as a young man was no longer the world of his childhood. By 1919, when he made the choice that would define the rest of his life, to join the Red Army, the Russian Empire had ceased to exist. The Bolsheviks had seized power 2 years earlier in Petrograd, and the great convulsion they had unleashed was still consuming everything in its path. Vatutin, now 18 years old, stood at a threshold that millions of his generation faced, though perhaps with less certainty than they might have wished. The choice to serve the revolutionary state was not, for many, truly a choice at all. It was more like being swept into a current so overwhelming that resistance became theoretical rather than practical. The Russian Civil War had begun in earnest by the time Vatutin enlisted, and it was unlike any conflict that had preceded it. This was not a war fought between nations in the traditional sense. It was a war of ideologies, of competing visions for what Russia should become, and it was fought with a cruelty that often exceeded that of the World War that had just ended. On one side stood the Red Army, hastily assembled from former imperial officers, revolutionary volunteers, and conscripted peasants, all supposed to be unified by belief in the October Revolution. On the other stood the White Armies, aristocratic, monarchist, nationalist, and desperate, along with foreign interventionist forces sent by Western powers to crush the Bolshevik experiment. Between them, the ordinary people of Russia suffered in ways that statistics can barely convey. Vatutin's early service placed him among those trying to forge order from chaos. He began not as a frontline soldier, but within the emerging apparatus of the Soviet military system. The Red Army that was taking shape in these years was an extraordinary creation, born of necessity, built by people who often had no experience in its building, yet animated by a fierce conviction that something fundamentally new was being constructed. Can you imagine such a thing? A nation at war with itself, an army being invented even as it fought for survival. There was an almost desperate improvisation to everything. Supply lines were nightmares. Communication was fragmentary. Soldiers often lacked proper uniforms, boots, and food. Yet somehow, through willpower and ideology, and the brutal enforcement of discipline, the Red Army began to hold. Vatutin entered this world as a young man of particular temperament. He was not a revolutionary fanatic, at least not in the way the most zealous party members were. Rather, he was someone who possessed a particular capacity. He could see order in chaos, could think systematically when everything around him was fragmentary. The records of his early service are sparse, but what emerges is a portrait of a young officer who paid attention, who learned quickly, who absorbed the strange language and organizational culture of the revolutionary military state, almost as if he had been born to it. In a world where ideology mattered officially, but competence mattered for survival, Vatutin seemed to understand intuitively how to navigate between them. The Civil War years, from roughly 1919 to 1922, were formative, not just militarily, but psychologically. This was when Vatutin was exposed, for the first time in any sustained way, to the violence of human combat. The Civil War was not a distant thing to be observed through newspapers or reports. It was immediate, visceral, often chaotic. The line between soldier and non-combatant, between military action and what we would now call atrocities, was desperately blurred. The Bolsheviks committed acts of terror against their enemies and against their own population. The Whites committed counter-terror in response. Vatutin, moving through this landscape as a junior officer, would have witnessed things designed to harden him, to teach him that the revolution, if it was to survive, could not afford the luxury of conventional morality. What did it mean, one might gently ask, to build something entirely new while surrounded by the burning ruins of the old? This question hung over everyone in those years. For some, the answer was ecstatic. The revolution represented liberation, the birth of a new human consciousness, the dawn of a world without class and suffering. For others, it was more ambiguous. Vatutin does not appear in the historical record as a man given to ecstatic declarations. Instead, he seems to have approached the revolution as a practical problem to be solved. The Bolsheviks had seized power. They were determined to hold it. If one wished to serve Russia at all during these years, service to the Soviet state was essentially the only option available. And so he served. The ideological world of the early Soviet state was simultaneously cynical and fervent, in ways that modern observers often find difficult to hold in mind at once. On the surface, official propaganda spoke of internationalism, revolutions spreading across the globe, the inevitable triumph of communism, and the withering away of the state itself. Yet the actual machinery of Soviet power was, even in these early years, intensely nationalist, centered on the survival and aggrandizement of the Russian state under new management. There was a contradiction here, but it was one that Soviet leaders had already learned to live with. And Vatutin, it seems, was someone for whom such contradictions caused no particular distress. He could serve the Soviet state as a Russian institution, while the state officially disavowed Russian nationalism. He could participate in a revolutionary military system while maintaining a kind of professional detachment from its ideological fervor. By the early 1920s, as the Civil War was drawing to a close and the Soviet state was consolidating its victory, Vatutin had established himself as a competent officer deserving of advancement. the bloodshed was beginning to diminish, though the violence of collectivization and political repression would soon take up where military combat had left off. But in these transitional years, there was something almost like a moment of breathing space. The immediate threat to Soviet survival had passed. The question that now occupied military theorists and planners was different. What kind of army should the Soviet Union build for the future? And what kind of officers should lead it? These questions would shape the path that Vatutin would take, carrying him from regimental service toward the higher reaches of military command, where the grand strategic problems of a great power would eventually become his responsibility. The young man from Chepokino village, who had grown up in a world of rural stability and the slow turning of the seasons, had been remade by these fires. He had entered the Red Army as a youth seeking position and stability in a collapsing world. He was emerging in the early 1920s as an officer with both technical competence and the crucial ability to move between the practical demands of military service and the ideological demands of a totalitarian state. This was his education in a new world, a world where the greatest danger might not be the enemy at the gates, but the contradictions and paranoia of the system one served. That knowledge, still nascent, still unformed in his mind, would become his constant companion in the years ahead. The path from rural Kursk to the corridors of Soviet military power was neither swift nor easy, and for a young man like Nikolai Vatutin, it would require patience, discipline, and an almost monastic devotion to the study of warfare itself. After his initial service in the Red Army during those chaotic years of civil war, years when ideology and desperation moved men more than doctrine, there came a recognition, quiet but unmistakable, that the new Soviet state would need officers who understood not merely how to fight, but how armies moved, how supply lines breathed, how thousands of men could be coordinated across vast distances like instruments in an orchestra. In 1921, as the Civil War's final embers cooled across the Russian steppe, Vatutin was selected to attend the Poltava Infantry School, a place that would become the first true crucible of his mind. The school itself was housed in buildings that had once served the Tsar's military structure, its classrooms and dormitories still bearing the faint shadows of that older order, now hastily repurposed for the revolutionary state's new officer corps. One might imagine the scene, young officers and soldiers arriving from campaigns where tactics had been improvised, where survival often trumped strategy, and now being asked to sit in orderly rows and study the geometry of formations, the supply calculations that determined whether armies advanced or retreated, the endless technical details that separate armies from mobs. Vatutin brought with him something precious from those years in the field, a mind already tested by reality, already shaped by the necessity of understanding how things actually worked, rather than how they appeared in theory. But at Poltava, he discovered that theory and practice were not enemies, but partners, and that a good military officer lived in the space between them. The instructors at Poltava, many of them officers from the old Imperial Army who had chosen to serve the Soviet regime, taught their students the fundamentals of infantry tactics, the principles of organization, the technical specifications of weapons and logistics. Vatutin absorbed this material with a methodical hunger that impressed his instructors, not flashy, not the sort of brilliant improvisation that sometimes catches attention in military settings, but rather a careful, thorough mastery that would serve him far better over the long decades of his career. What kind of officer was Vatutin becoming, we might ask, in those quiet years at school? The archival records speak of someone already set apart by a particular temperament, serious where others joked, studious where others socialized, seemingly indifferent to the camaraderie and competitions that bound other young officers together. Whether this reflected his personality or a deliberate choice, a kind of self-discipline that his rural background may have instilled, is perhaps unknowable. What emerges clearly is that by the time he completed his studies at Poltava, he had distinguished himself as a student with an unusual gift for understanding complex systems, for grasping how decisions at one point rippled outward through an entire apparatus. But Poltava was only the beginning, and perhaps precisely because Vatutin showed such promise, he was selected for further advancement. In 1923, he moved on to the Kiev Higher Military School, an institution considerably more prestigious, more rigorous, and more closely aligned with the emerging General Staff's vision of what a truly modern Soviet military should become. Kiev, the ancient city that had once been the heart of Kievan Rus, was itself a living reminder of history's layers. Vatutin would have walked streets where Mongol Khans once rode, where medieval princes once ruled, where generations of empires had left their marks. Now it was a center of Soviet military thought, and he was entering its inner sanctum. The Kiev Higher Military School operated at a different tempo than Poltava. Its curriculum was designed not simply to produce competent line officers, but to cultivate minds capable of strategic thought, of understanding the broader architecture of warfare. Here, in addition to technical military subjects, students studied history, and not the simplified revolutionary history of Soviet propaganda, but real military history, the campaigns of Napoleon, the Prussian innovations of the 19th century, the campaigns of the Russo-Japanese War, and the Great War that had shaken the old empires to their foundations. Students studied not only what to do, but why, the logic behind maneuvers, the relationship between terrain and tactics, the complex interplay of supply, morale, and timing that determined victory or defeat. This was where Vatutin's mind truly began to crystallize into the distinctive shape it would maintain throughout his life. Here he encountered instructors and fellow students who shared his methodical approach to warfare, who saw the military profession not as a pathway to glory or political power, but as a genuine technical discipline requiring years of study and reflection. We might wonder, did Vatutin sense even then that he was being groomed for something larger? The Soviet military establishment was consciously working to modernize itself, to shake off the improvisational chaos of the Civil War years and build a genuine officer corps capable of commanding massive, modern forces. Vatutin had the right temperament, the right intellectual gifts, and the right absence of personal ambition. He wanted to master his profession, not to promote himself, and in an institution where every officer was watching every other officer for signs of disloyalty or ideological unreliability, that focused dedication was itself a kind of survival strategy. By the time Vatutin graduated from Kiev, somewhere around 1925 or 1926, he had already been identified as officer material of the highest order. The records of the period are fragmentary, but what we know suggests that he had impressed his instructors not through dramatic demonstrations of brilliance, but through a steady, almost quiet mastery of the material, through an ability to grasp the interconnections between different aspects of military science, and through a kind of intellectual honesty that made him willing to admit when he did not understand something rather than to bluster or pretend. These are not the qualities that typically make men famous, but they are very much the qualities that make men dangerous to their enemies and valuable to their nations. What was being forged in Vatutin during these years of study was something subtle but profound. The character of a planner, a man who understood that modern warfare was increasingly an exercise in logistics and coordination, in moving men and supplies across vast distances with precision, in orchestrating multiple units toward a common objective, in thinking not in terms of individual battles, but of campaigns that unfolded over months and across territories as large as entire European countries. This understanding would shape everything he did in the decades to come, would make him invaluable when the Soviet state faced its greatest crisis, would also, in its way, define the peculiar tragedy of his life. For a man who understood systems, who saw the broader patterns, might be the sort of man who asked uncomfortable questions, the sort of man who pointed out when something was failing or illogical, and in a political system as paranoid and internally fractious as Stalin's Soviet Union, that could be a very dangerous thing indeed. The years of study ended. The education was complete, or as complete as any military education could be at that moment in history. Vatutin emerged into a Soviet military establishment that was rapidly expanding, rapidly modernizing, and rapidly becoming aware of the ideological passions and political dangers that swirled around it. He had learned to think, to analyze, to see military problems in their full complexity. Now he would have to learn to navigate the far more treacherous terrain of Soviet military politics, where a man's survival depended not only on competence, but on careful attention to the currents of ideology and power. The 1920s and 1930s were years in which the Soviet officer corps learned to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously: that they were the vanguard of a new and revolutionary epoch, and that the state they served trusted them scarcely at all. For a man like Nikolai Vatutin, climbing methodically through the ranks of military schools and emerging into the general staff with growing competence, this paradox was not abstract. It was the texture of daily life. When Vatutin completed his studies at the Kiev Higher Military School in the late 1920s, he entered an institution that was itself fragmented and uncertain. The Red Army had been forged in the crucible of civil war, but peace had brought a different kind of pressure. Lenin had died in 1924. Stalin was consolidating power through the latter part of the decade, and the question of what the Red Army ought to be, a revolutionary militia or a professional fighting force, remained contested, even dangerous to discuss too openly. The military establishment was split between old imperial officers retained for their expertise and younger revolutionary commissars appointed to watch them. Vatutin, a child of the revolution himself, belonged to neither camp entirely, which perhaps was a kind of advantage. The early 1930s brought relative stability to Vatutin's career. He rose into staff positions, worked diligently on operational planning, earned respect for his methodical approach to strategy and logistics. But the world around him was beginning to convulse. Stalin had turned his attention inward. The collectivization of agriculture was crushing the countryside. Millions were dying, and by 1935 or so, the machinery of terror began its long reach toward the military. Generals and officers who had seemed secure, who had served well in the Civil War or in the early defense of the revolution, began to disappear. Their arrests were sudden. Their trials, when public, were grotesque spectacles of forced confessions and accusations of treason and fascist collaboration. The purges of the late 1930s remain one of the most bewildering chapters in Soviet history. Between 1937 and 1938 particularly, the Red Army lost an astonishing proportion of its senior and mid-level officer corps. Marshals, generals, colonels, men who had fought for the revolution and led soldiers with competence, were convicted of conspiracies that almost certainly never existed. Some historians suggest that Stalin feared the military might become a rival center of power. Others point to personal paranoia, to feuds within the Central Committee, to denunciations that spiraled into cascading arrests. The truth, as is often the case with terror, was probably a mixture of all these things, made more terrible by the fact that the purges fed on themselves. How did Nikolai Vatutin survive when so many around him did not? The archives provide us with fragments, but not a complete answer. He was not prominent enough, perhaps, to attract the highest attention. He was not known to have made enemies among Stalin's inner circle. He worked quietly on his assignments. He joined the Communist Party in 1930, as many officers did, which was a kind of conformity expected and rewarded. He was methodical, obedient, and seemingly free of the kind of charismatic ambition that sometimes drew suspicion. But survival in those years was also partly luck, a kind of hideous lottery in which being unknown or unremarkable could save your life. Vatutin's colleagues in the General Staff were not so fortunate. General Alexander Yegorov, one of the Red Army's most celebrated commanders from the Civil War era, was arrested in 1938 and shot. Yegorov had served in high positions. Vatutin may well have known him. In the autumn of 1937, the new chief of the General Staff, Alexander Yegorov's predecessor, was arrested. By 1938, 3 successive chiefs of the General Staff had either been purged or were soon to be. The institutional memory of the Red Army was being systematically erased. Entire departments were gutted. Orders and counter-orders emanated from Moscow as the paranoia deepened. What must it have been like to arrive at military headquarters not knowing whether a colleague would be there to greet you or whether that person had vanished in the night? To receive a phone call that was not a phone call but a summons to the Lubyanka. To know that denunciation could come from anyone, a superior officer, a party commissar, a rival, even a friend seeking to save their own skin. The terror of those years was not merely a series of events. It was a state of being, a permanent erosion of the ground beneath your feet. Yet the Red Army continued to function, in a manner of speaking. Yet the machinery of strategy and planning did not simply cease. Officers like Vatutin kept working, kept analyzing the international situation, kept writing memos and attending meetings. One wonders whether this very ordinariness was itself a survival mechanism, the performance of normalcy in an environment fundamentally abnormal. Vatutin seems to have been a man comfortable with such a performance. He was not known for grand gestures or emotional volatility. He was a staff officer, which meant he worked behind maps and papers and communiques, not in the spotlight of public life or factional politics. By 1940, the worst of the purges had receded, at least in its most acute phase. Some historians have suggested that Stalin realized, as war clouds gathered over Europe, that a completely decimated officer corps would be a liability. A handful of surviving generals were rehabilitated, their honor partially restored, their experience suddenly valuable again. Vatutin was still a colonel at this time, a senior staff officer, but not yet a general. He had weathered the terror not by being brave, perhaps, but by being careful, by being competent without being brilliant enough to threaten, by carrying out orders without question, by belonging to no faction and promoting no ideological line beyond loyalty to the state. The scars of the purges, however, remained. They shaped the mindset of every officer who survived them. There was a learned caution, a way of speaking that avoided strong opinions. There was a permanent awareness that ideology trumped expertise in Soviet military life, that a general could be right about operational matters and still find himself arrested on charges of political disloyalty. And there was the peculiar isolation that such an atmosphere creates, the sense that your neighbors and colleagues are potential informants, that trust is a luxury no one can truly afford. For Vatutin and men like him, this became simply the condition of existence. One did not question it. One adapted to it. One survived it, hopefully, and moved forward into whatever came next. By the 1930s, Nikolai Vatutin had begun to inhabit a different world than the one he had survived through the purges, where so many of his contemporaries had vanished into the machinery of fear, arrested in the night, their names erased from rosters and memory alike. Vatutin moved upward with a quiet, almost geometrical precision that seemed somehow to carry him above the worst of the terror's reach. Not untouched, never untouched, but ascending nonetheless. And the instrument of that ascent was not fortune or connections alone, though both mattered, but something rarer still, a reputation for methodical brilliance that had begun to mark him as different from the swaggering cavalry officers and political generals who had dominated Red Army culture through the 20s. The turning point came around 1934, when Vatutin secured a posting to the Red Army's General Staff Academy in Moscow, an institution that was itself becoming a sort of refuge for serious military minds, a place where technical competence and intellectual rigor were beginning to outweigh the revolutionary credentials that had once been paramount. It was during these years that Vatutin's talent for what might be called military architecture truly began to crystallize. He possessed an almost architectural mind, in a sense, the ability to survey a vast and chaotic problem and to discern within it the underlying structure, the lines of logic and weight-bearing principle that others could not immediately perceive. Colleagues began to remark, in those careful, whispered tones that prudence required, that when Vatutin took a pencil to a map or drafted an operational outline, something emerged that had clarity, that had elegance even. Not the crude improvisation of wartime necessity, but the sort of planning that seemed to anticipate complications several moves in advance, the work of someone thinking in dimensions that others had not yet recognized. By the middle of the decade, Vatutin had begun to gravitate toward the orbit of Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, a figure whose own reputation had weathered the purges with remarkable resilience. Shaposhnikov was, in many ways, the embodiment of the sort of officer that could survive Stalin's Red Army, technically accomplished, politically cautious to the point of near invisibility, utterly devoted to the systematic improvement of Soviet military capacity. And something in Vatutin's temperament, his quiet diligence, his almost scholarly approach to problems of tactics and strategy, resonated with Shaposhnikov's own sensibilities. The younger officer began to appear more frequently in the marshal's presence, was assigned to increasingly sensitive planning tasks, and gradually found himself becoming part of the inner circle of officers who directly shaped the General Staff's strategic thinking. What emerges from the fragmentary records that survive from these years is a portrait of a man in his mid-30s who had somehow learned to navigate the paradox of Stalinist military life, to be competent and reliable without being so prominent as to draw dangerous attention, to contribute to the system without becoming too visibly associated with any particular outcome that might later be questioned. Did he have patrons? Yes, certainly. Did he avoid saying things that might be held against him? Almost certainly. But he also seemed to possess something more, a kind of intellectual humility that, paradoxically, marked him as trustworthy. He did not claim to have all answers. He was not the sort of officer who had to be listened to because of his revolutionary pedigree or his political connections. He could be heard because when he spoke about the problems of troop deployment or supply lines or the integration of armor and infantry, he typically knew more than the person listening to him. The Red Army of the 1930s was, beneath the surface of its Soviet ideological rhetoric, undergoing a profound intellectual transformation. The cavalry enthusiasts and the advocates of deep battle who had dominated military discourse in the 20s were gradually giving way to a new cohort of officers who were attempting to absorb the lessons of modern warfare as practiced in the West, the French, the Germans, the Italians. What did armored warfare mean for Soviet military doctrine? How should the enormous territorial expanse of the Soviet Union shape the strategy of defense or counter-offense? How could the Red Army, which would have to fight on its own soil if invasion came, best organize itself to resist an industrialized enemy? These were the questions that occupied serious military minds during this period, and Vatutin was increasingly becoming one of the people who helped shape the answers. By 1938 and 1939, as the international situation deteriorated and the probability of a European war began to seem less like speculation and more like an approaching storm, Vatutin had consolidated a position of genuine influence within the General Staff. He held several significant posts in those final pre-war years, assignments that gave him responsibility for major aspects of military planning. He was not the sort of officer whose name appeared in newspapers or who was celebrated in propaganda. Indeed, his very effectiveness seemed to depend on a certain invisibility, on the capacity to do vital work without demanding or receiving public recognition. But within the closed world of the military hierarchy, among the men who actually thought through the problems of defense and offense, who wrestled with maps and figures and the abstract architecture of strategy, Vatutin's reputation had begun to shine with a steadier light. What had made this possible? It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this late hour, to consider what combination of qualities allowed one officer to rise while others around him fell. Certainly, technical skill mattered, but so did something less obvious, a kind of emotional intelligence perhaps, or simply the capacity to understand that in a regime built on fear and suspicion, the way to survive was not to seem dangerous. Vatutin had the good fortune or the wisdom, the distinction is sometimes unclear, to appear always to be serving something larger than himself, to be in service to the Red Army and to Stalin's vision of Soviet power, rather than to personal ambition. Whether this was entirely genuine or a mask worn with perfect consistency is something we can never quite know, but it worked. It carried him upward as the terror claimed so many others, as the officer corps was shattered and reformed and shattered again. By the time the 1930s had drawn to their close and the 1940s beckoned, Vatutin stood not as a decorated hero or a political favorite, but as something perhaps more valuable to the Soviet state, a trusted technician of war, a man who knew how to think about the problems that would soon arrive at the gates of the Soviet Union with enormous violence and precision. By the early months of 1941, the Soviet Union had settled into a peculiar and dangerous peace, a vast state moving with mechanical confidence toward an appointment with catastrophe it did not yet know was fixed upon its calendar. Stalin's purges had receded into history, and the Red Army, though still bearing the deep scars of those terrible years, had begun to reconstitute itself with officers who had somehow survived the terror and younger men who had never known its shadow. The General Staff in Moscow occupied its buildings with an almost bureaucratic routineness, and among those threadbare corridors and lamplit offices, amid the clicking of typewriters and the whisper of maps being unfolded and refolded, Nikolai Vatutin had become one of the most trusted voices in the machinery of Soviet military thought. The question that hung over those early months, and which none of the strategic planners wished to ask aloud, was simple and terrible. What did Adolf Hitler intend? The Nazi regime had violated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in its occupation of the Rump Czech state the previous year, and the atmosphere of European politics had begun to congeal into a cold, expectant dread. Yet Moscow itself seemed to move in the grip of an illusion, a kind of strategic wishful thinking that whispered that the moment of German aggression, if it was coming at all, lay safely somewhere in the distant future, 1942 perhaps, or even beyond. There was time. The belief that there was time carried an almost narcotic quality through the upper echelons of Soviet command. Vatutin, in his capacity as deputy chief of the General Staff and as one of Stalin's favored military minds, found himself caught in the strange position of being asked to plan for a war he was not quite permitted to believe was imminent. He had mastered, through the years of the terror and its aftermath, the delicate art of speaking truth to power in ways that did not fundamentally disturb power's existing assumptions. It was a skill that had kept him alive when so many of his contemporaries had vanished into the basements of the NKVD. Yet he was also a professional soldier, trained in the rigorous discipline of the General Staff, and such men do not ignore warnings that their instincts and their calculations both suggest are real. The intelligence flowing into Moscow from various sources had grown increasingly specific as spring approached. There were German troop movements in Poland, the gathering of supplies along the Soviet frontier, the massing of transport aircraft at aerodromes in the western districts of the Reich. Vatutin and his colleagues in the planning apparatus saw these signs as clearly as anyone might read large print. And so, in the early months of 1941, the question became not whether to prepare for a German invasion, but how to frame that preparation in such a way that it did not openly contradict the optimistic assumptions that Stalin himself had chosen to embrace. One thinks of the paradox that occupied Soviet military minds in those months before June. How does a general staff plan for war while its supreme leader insists that war is not coming, or is coming only on a timeline that permits leisurely preparations? It was a contradiction that could not be resolved through logic, and so it had to be resolved through bureaucracy, through the careful accumulation of contingency plans that were simultaneously denied to be contingency plans. Vatutin participated in this strange dance of preparation and concealment with the practiced grace of a man who understood that his own survival depended upon it. The Soviet military intelligence apparatus, the Fourth Directorate, had produced increasingly alarmed reports throughout the winter and spring. German officers were being recalled from Moscow. Embassy staff was being quietly withdrawn. The balance of forces along the frontier was shifting in ways that could not be explained as anything other than preparation for invasion. Yet these reports were received by Stalin with skepticism, or worse, with irritation. The General Secretary had convinced himself that Hitler would not move against the Soviet Union until Britain had been defeated, and that Britain's defeat lay still at some indeterminate point in the future. To suggest otherwise was to contradict Stalin's reading of the strategic situation, and to contradict Stalin was to invite both professional and personal danger. He continued his work within the General Staff, participating in the planning processes that assumed the war would come, but channeling that planning through the language of theoretical exercises and defensive preparations that could theoretically be explained as responses to the general international situation rather than specific preparation for a German invasion. It was the art of speaking sideways to power, of ensuring that serious military preparations were underway while maintaining the surface illusion that the Supreme Command was not yet persuaded of their necessity. The files and memoranda that passed across Vatutin's desk in those months reveal a man thinking deeply about operational doctrine, about the positioning of reserves, about the communication systems that would be necessary if war came in the West. He was, in effect, preparing for a catastrophe that his boss had decided to refuse to acknowledge, and he was doing it in a way that preserved both his professional integrity and his life. It was perhaps the most delicate balancing act of his military career thus far. One might wonder what conversations took place in the quiet offices of the General Staff, when officers met away from the ears of informers and spoke with genuine candor about what they believed was coming. Did Vatutin speak with his colleagues about the mounting evidence? Did they discuss, in the privacy of professional trust, the possibility that Stalin's reading of German intentions might be mistaken? The historical record is largely silent on such conversations, as it often is. Men who have seen the consequences of indiscreet speech learn to keep their deepest thoughts carefully guarded, even, perhaps especially, from their closest colleagues. As March turned to April, and April toward May, the intelligence continued to accumulate. The German order of battle became ever more visible to Soviet observers, the concentration of forces along the frontier ever more obvious. And yet, the official posture in Moscow remained one of public calm, even as behind the scenes, the military apparatus quietly accelerated its preparations. It was a contradiction that could not hold forever, but for now it held, maintained in place by the force of Stalin's will and by the discipline of men like Vatutin, who understood that their role was not to challenge the leader's assumptions, but to ensure that, regardless of what was officially believed, the Red Army would be as ready as possible for the crisis that professional judgment insisted was coming. The spring of 1941 carried within it a quality of suspended dread, a kind of temporal tension in which one era was slowly, inexorably coming to an end, while another era, terrible and transformative, was gathering at the frontier, waiting only for the moment of unleashing. Vatutin moved through those months doing his work, reading the maps, listening to the reports, and slowly preparing in the only ways he was permitted to prepare for the catastrophe that everyone could see coming, but which no one was allowed to say aloud was coming. The certainty that had settled over Vatutin's work in the spring of 1941, the measured confidence of a brilliant staff officer moving through his calculations and his maps, would dissolve almost entirely in the space of a single dawn. On the 22nd of June, as German bombers crossed into Soviet airspace and mechanized columns began their terrible push across the frontier, the entire architecture of Soviet military planning, the assumptions, the timelines, the reassurances that had circulated through the General Staff's offices for months, collapsed into chaos and improvisation. Vatutin, who had spent the previous years perfecting the art of orderly strategy, now found himself caught in the first raw moments of a war that would dwarf anything his calculations had imagined. The initial German thrust into the northwestern sector was almost impossibly swift. Motorized divisions raced through territories that Soviet planners had envisioned as buffer zones, overwhelming frontier garrison forces that had been deployed thinly and without adequate preparation for the intensity of the assault. Communications between command centers fractured almost at once. Rear echelon officers found themselves isolated from the front. Vatutin, stationed in Moscow with the General Staff apparatus, could only watch as reports arrived in fragments, incomplete, often contradictory, each more alarming than the last. The illusion of a gradual, controllable escalation that some in the Soviet command structure had clung to vanished in the thunderous percussion of artillery and the grinding of tank treads. Within days, as the full scope of the invasion became undeniable, the need for skilled officers who could move quickly through collapsing sectors became desperate. Vatutin's reputation as a meticulous, analytical military mind, someone who could assess a broken situation and formulate coherent responses, made him invaluable. He was dispatched northward as a troubleshooter, an intermediary between Stalin's increasingly frantic directives and the realities of armies in retreat. The shift from the ordered world of staff work to the raw uncertainty of the front was disorienting. Plans that had seemed elegant on paper dissolved when they met the unpredictable violence of combat. Orders that had been issued with confidence from Moscow became irrelevant within hours, as circumstances changed faster than communications could track. The northwestern sector, where German Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Lieb, was driving toward Leningrad, became Vatutin's initial responsibility. The advancing German forces had already begun to encircle Soviet formations, cutting off retreat routes and trapping entire divisions in pockets. Vatutin found himself attempting to coordinate the movements of armies that were fragmenting, to preserve units that were dissolving under pressure, to maintain some semblance of organized resistance in situations that had deteriorated beyond the point of orderly management. The scale of the catastrophe was almost impossible to comprehend. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in those early weeks. Entire mechanized corps that had existed on paper as formidable instruments of war proved powerless against the coordinated assault of the Wehrmacht's invasion force. What emerged from those first chaotic months was something unexpected. Rather than being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, as many officers were, Vatutin seemed to find his true capacity in crisis. The methodical mind that had thrived on planning and analysis now revealed itself to be adaptable, capable of functioning in the fog of war where certainty dissolved and judgment had to be made on incomplete information. He worked without sleep, moving between command posts, assessing situations, attempting to salvage what could be salvaged from the wreckage. The measured tone that had characterized his staff work gave way to an urgent, almost frenetic energy, yet the clarity of his thinking remained. In those first months, Vatutin developed a reputation for steadiness that others found sustaining. In an environment where panic was spreading, where officers were being executed for failing to achieve impossible objectives, where the entire foundation of Soviet military authority seemed to be collapsing, Vatutin's presence conveyed the possibility that order could be restored, that someone understood what needed to be done. He was not a charismatic leader in the mold that Soviet propaganda would later celebrate. He was not visibly optimistic or given to rousing speeches. Rather, his strength lay in his unflappable competence, his ability to make rational assessments of impossible situations and to extract whatever margin of advantage remained in desperate circumstances. The reports that came back from officers who served near him during this period suggested something of his manner. He asked penetrating questions. He demanded accuracy in information rather than reassuring fictions. He could become sharp with officers who panicked or who attempted to obscure the truth of their situations. But he also conveyed, through the sheer steadiness of his focus, that survival was possible, that organized resistance could be maintained even as the collapse continued around them. In those months when Soviet military authority seemed to be dissolving into chaos, such steadiness was worth more than grand strategy. By autumn of 1941, Vatutin had begun to emerge as one of the handful of officers upon whom Stalin and the Soviet High Command were beginning to rely. The initial catastrophe of the invasion's opening phase had killed or discredited thousands of Soviet commanders. Entire staffs had been obliterated or found themselves cut off as German forces advanced. Those who survived, those who had navigated the chaos without either losing their nerve or attempting to conceal the truth of their situations, became increasingly precious. Vatutin was among them. The transition from brilliant staff officer to frontline troubleshooter had not diminished him. If anything, it had revealed depths of capability that his earlier, more orderly service had only hinted at. The man who had calculated in the abstract now found himself calculating in blood and fire, and something in his nature responded to the terrible clarity of that new arithmetic. Yet this very emergence into prominence, this visibility and growing indispensability during the first desperate phase of the Soviet war effort, was beginning to mark him in ways that would have consequences he could not yet foresee. In the Soviet system, to be noticed was always a complex blessing, carrying within it the seeds of future danger as much as future advancement. Vatutin was becoming someone whom Stalin knew, someone whose name appeared in reports, someone whose judgment mattered in the most critical moments. The quiet competence that had once allowed him to move through the machinery of Soviet military power with relative safety was giving way to something more exposed, more visible, more vulnerable to the capricious currents of power that swirled around the Soviet dictator. By the summer of 1942, the German armies had driven so far into Soviet territory that the maps in Moscow's command centers seemed almost unrecognizable when compared to those of a year before. Stalingrad was not yet the obsession it would become. It was simply another city in a seemingly endless march eastward, and the real crisis was gathering along a front that stretched like a wound across the southern Ukrainian and Russian landscape. It was into this fracturing sector that Nikolai Vatutin was sent to assume command of the Voronezh front, and there, in those dark months when Soviet fortunes appeared almost irredeemably broken, his true gifts as a commander would begin to crystallize. The Voronezh region itself was a patchwork of steppe and forest. a landscape that seemed to absorb suffering without showing mercy to either side. The Don River wound through it like a vein, and it was this geography, this particular arrangement of rivers and ravines and open ground, that would shape every calculation Vatutin would make. When he arrived at his headquarters in late June, the situation was one of cascading crisis. The Germans had burst through the initial Soviet defensive lines, and Romanian and Hungarian armies, pressed into service as Germany's reluctant allies, were sweeping eastward with an almost casual brutality. The Second Hungarian Army was advancing rapidly, and the Fourth Panzer Army, under Hermann Hoth, was driving toward a junction that would, if unopposed, cut the Soviet southern front into pieces. What Vatutin inherited was not an organized front, but rather a collection of desperate improvised positions, units thrown together from whatever was available, depleted rifle divisions mixed with fragments of tank corps, some commanders barely in place for more than a few days before being shuffled elsewhere, supply lines that existed more in theory than in fact. The exhaustion was visible in the faces of every soldier, and the confidence had largely evaporated. He established his command post in a modest building in Voronezh itself, positioning himself where he could observe reports flowing in from the various army commanders under his control, each of them fighting their own private wars against a seemingly inexhaustible German advance. The early days of Vatutin's command were consumed with a particular kind of triage, not saving lives so much as determining which positions could still hold, which must be abandoned, and where a defense might be constructed that could at least slow the German momentum. This was a calculation that required not optimism, but rather a hard, almost clinical assessment of what resources existed and how far they might stretch. He understood, in a way that some of his peers did not always grasp, that a fighting retreat, if properly conducted, was not a failure, but a survival mechanism. The goal was not to hold every meter of ground, that was impossible, but to maintain a coherent force that could trade space for time, gradually stabilizing as more reserves became available. Throughout July, the situation remained dire. German advances continued, sometimes slowed by hastily prepared defensive lines, but never truly halted. Vatutin moved between his headquarters and forward positions, studying the ground, conferring with army commanders, adjusting dispositions with a kind of methodical persistence that seemed immune to despair. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or inspiring speeches. Instead, he communicated through orders, through the careful placement of reserves, through a visible presence that conveyed the message that someone was thinking clearly about the chaos unfolding around them. One of Vatutin's principal strengths lay in his ability to coordinate operations across difficult terrain and against enemies who possessed substantial advantages in mobility and firepower. The Hungarian armies, though not as formidable as German units, were advancing with enough momentum that left unchecked they could have created a catastrophic breach. Vatutin began positioning forces, always limited, always stretched beyond what logic might recommend, at points where they might disrupt or delay the Hungarian advance just enough to allow other units to regroup or take up new positions. This was not a strategy that produced victories in any conventional sense. Rather, it was a strategy of managed contraction, of trading ground for the maintenance of a front that remained nominally coherent even as it bent backward. By August, something subtle began to shift in the character of the fighting along the Voronezh front. The German advance, which had seemed so irresistible in late June and July, had begun to show signs of exhaustion. Supply lines were stretched across hundreds of kilometers of captured territory. The Red Army, though badly mauled, had begun to accumulate reserves from deeper in Soviet territory, fresh divisions arriving, damaged units being withdrawn to refit, replacements flowing forward through a logistics network that, for all its inadequacies, had recovered somewhat from the initial shock. Vatutin's front was still in retreat, still under pressure, but it had become a retreating force that maintained its cohesion rather than a force in disintegration. This slow stabilization was achieved through small, unglamorous measures that rarely appear in the official histories. It was the careful rationing of artillery ammunition to preserve it for the most critical moments. It was the positioning of anti-tank guns at angles where they could strike approaching German vehicles before being quickly relocated. It was the organization of local counterattacks, always limited in scope, always aimed at disrupting German momentum rather than producing breakthroughs. It was the steady flow of orders and communications that transformed a collection of frightened men into an instrument that, while far from invincible, had regained a sense of purpose. Vatutin's relationship with his commanders during this period was marked by a kind of mutual respect rooted in shared hardship. He did not blame them for the failures that accumulated in those early weeks. Failure was endemic to the entire Soviet front, a consequence of German superiority in combined arms tactics and initiative. Instead, he worked with them to identify what could be salvaged from each crisis, how to extract damaged units, how to establish new positions on better ground. There was no room for recrimination or the settling of scores. Survival was the only metric that mattered, and Vatutin provided the kind of calm, methodical leadership that offered at least a glimpse of a future beyond the immediate catastrophe. As autumn approached, the Voronezh front had moved through its crisis without being annihilated. The Don River had been held, more or less, and a new defensive line was beginning to take shape. The front was still hundreds of kilometers from where it had stood at the beginning of summer, and Soviet losses had been staggering. And yet something profound had changed. The Voronezh front, under Vatutin's command, had become a force that could look the German armies in the face without flinching, could absorb blows and remain standing, could plan for more than mere survival. It was in this context, in this slow transformation from crisis management to something approaching genuine operational planning, that the Battle of Stalingrad would unfold to the south, and that Vatutin's real historical significance would begin to emerge from the shadow of those desperate summer months. By the autumn of 1942, the great city on the Volga had become something less a place of victory than a grinding contest of attrition, where every street and every rubble heap extracted its price in blood. And yet within the Soviet High Command, there was a different kind of battle taking shape. One fought not with rifles and grenades, but with maps, calculations, and the terrible patience required to orchestrate the movements of hundreds of thousands of men across a continental expanse. Vatutin, now commanding the Southwest Front, was at the heart of this vast geometric puzzle, and it was his mind, his capacity to hold multiple armies in simultaneous motion within the architecture of his imagination, that would help stitch together the encirclement that history would remember as Operation Uranus. The Germans, in their confidence, had stretched their lines thin along the Don and the upper Volga. Their allies, the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian contingents, held the flanks with a certain threadbare resolve, but Vatutin and his counterpart to the south, General Yeremenko, could read in those dispositions the brittle vulnerability of overextension. The northern pincers would fall to Vatutin, Yeremenko would command the southern thrust, and together, if timing held, if weather permitted, if the logistical miracle of supplying so many divisions could somehow be sustained, they might trap an entire army. But the word might carried the weight of 1,000-ton consequences. What is remarkable, when one sits with the historical record at this distance, is how much of what happened at Stalingrad was not spontaneous fury, but rather the patient elaboration of a plan conceived in autumn stillness far behind the lines. Vatutin spent weeks in the modest headquarters of the Southwest Front, examining every variable. How many reserves could be gathered from the quiet sectors to the north? How many tank corps could be relocated without alerting German reconnaissance? What were the true capacities of the rail network beneath them? Could ammunition, fuel, and food be stockpiled in sufficient quantity to sustain a multi-million-man offensive without betraying its imminence? These were not questions that found their answers in maps alone, but rather in the slow interrogation of possibility itself. The northern encircling force, under Vatutin's direct coordination, would need to pivot south from positions near the Don at a precise moment in time. The army of General Romanenko would form the cutting edge. Behind it would follow mobile corps of cavalry and mechanized forces intended to deepen and widen the breach. But everything depended on achieving surprise, despite the enormous visible movement required. Vatutin understood that the Germans, for all their proficiency, were weary after months of grinding street combat. Exhaustion can dull even the sharpest awareness. Supply lines stretched backward hundreds of kilometers. Reserves were dispersed. The Romanians on the flank, proud in their way but under-equipped and under-resourced, could be the pressure point. Consider the peculiar challenge facing any commander in such circumstances. Vatutin could not simply order the attack to begin. The weather had to cooperate. The muddy Rasputitsa, that seasonal quagmire that renders the Russian earth nearly impassable, could either work against an advance or provide cover for its assembly. The temperature would need to be cold enough, but not so catastrophically cold as to freeze engines and men simultaneously. And the intelligence from spies, from intercepted signals, from prisoners of war, all had to continue flowing without suggesting the full scale of Soviet intentions. In this orchestration of uncertainty, Vatutin operated with a kind of stoic composure that those around him remarked upon. The night of November 19th approached, and somewhere in the darkness before the attack, Vatutin likely permitted himself a moment of that peculiar loneliness which descends upon commanders before vast operations. The maps were ready, the orders had been written and distributed. The men were in position. Everything that human will and planning could accomplish had been accomplished. Now came the domain of chance, of friction, of the countless small failures and unexpected victories that no amount of forethought could entirely anticipate. When the artillery began at dawn, it was not the localized fury of a street battle, but rather a rolling thunder that stretched along lines many kilometers in length. The guns were meant to be not only destructive, but disorienting, a wall of noise and explosive force designed to break the Germans' will to resist before the infantry even moved. Vatutin, in his headquarters, would have received the reports as the day unfolded. The Romanians, as suspected, were beginning to crumble. The breakthrough was opening. Behind the initial assault troops, the mobile forces were being fed through the gaps in the line, turning fluid and rapid now, speeding southward while other armies pressed from other directions. But what is often forgotten in the triumphalism that surrounds the encirclement is how fragile it remained even as it was forming. The Germans retained the ability to counterattack, to punch through the Soviet forces that were trying to close the ring. A competent commander might have opened a corridor of escape. General Paulus, who led the Sixth Army, requested permission to attempt a breakout. The permission was refused by Adolf Hitler himself, who demanded that the surrounded city be held, and so the encirclement, which had begun as a daring maneuver conducted with meticulous care, gradually transformed into something more rigid, more brutal, a slowly tightening noose. Vatutin's role in the weeks that followed was to maintain the pressure without exhausting the reserves that the Soviet forces still needed for operations elsewhere along the front. How does one continue an advance when supply lines stretch backward across a frozen landscape, when the soldiers themselves are becoming casualties not to enemy fire, but to cold and hunger? When the enemy, though surrounded, still fights with the desperation of the condemned. These were not questions that found clean answers. They were answered instead through a kind of managed suffering, a careful rationing of men and resources, and an understanding that victory of this magnitude would demand a terrible price. The historical significance of Vatutin's role in the encirclement operations has sometimes been overshadowed by the celebrity of other commanders, or by the sheer dramatic weight of the street fighting that preceded and followed it. And yet it was precisely this capacity, to conceive a vast pincer movement, to coordinate multiple fronts operating independently yet toward a single strategic goal, to maintain discipline and patience in the face of the chaos that war continuously generated, that marked Vatutin as one of the Soviet Union's most capable operational minds. He did not win at Stalingrad through audacity alone, but through the slow, methodical accumulation of advantages, the patient assembly of overwhelming force, and the capacity to maintain clarity of vision even as the fog of war swirled around him. In a very real sense, Vatutin had become the kind of general that modern warfare demanded, not a romantic figure on horseback, but a student of logistics, probability, and the delicate mathematics of moving armies across impossible terrain. And so we arrive now at the quieter chambers of command, where the real architecture of war took shape not in the thunder of artillery, but in the careful, methodical work of men bent over maps, in the half-light of oil lamps, in the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually translate into the movement of armies across frozen earth. This is where Nikolai Vatutin spent the hours that no history book captures, the stretches between the great battles when the machinery of war had to be maintained, repaired, reimagined for the next phase of struggle. Picture, if you can, the headquarters tent in winter, perhaps in 1943, as the Red Army was beginning to sense, for the first time, that the impossible reversal might actually be possible. The canvas ripples slightly with the wind that carries the sharp bite of Russian cold. Inside, there are perhaps 3 oil lamps burning, their flames wavering with each draft that finds its way through gaps in the fabric, casting shadows that seem to move across the maps spread across the wooden tables. These maps are not static things. They are living documents, constantly being updated with pencil marks, with notations in careful handwriting, with small flags and markers that represent the positions of divisions, regiments, the estimated locations of German forces, the supply lines, the roads that might be passable in the spring thaw, the rivers that would need to be crossed. Vatutin would stand at such a table for hours, sometimes in silence, absorbing the information, allowing the landscape itself to become a kind of companion in his thinking. The dispatches arrived constantly, carried by young officers, sometimes on horseback, sometimes by radio telephone that crackled with static, and the thin voices of men, somewhere in the darkness, reporting what they could see, what they suspected, what their scouts had discovered. There was always a delay between what was actually happening on the ground and what made its way to headquarters. A gap in time that every commander had to account for, had to imagine into. This is where Vatutin's methodical mind, the discipline that had been formed in him since childhood in that small village of Chepukino, revealed its deepest value. He did not react hastily to reports. He waited, he listened to what others said, he considered the probabilities, and only then did he issue orders that would send men forward into danger. The people around him in these headquarters were, in many ways, the architects of Soviet victory, though history would rarely name them. There were intelligence officers who had learned to read the rhythms of German command, to anticipate where the next blow might fall. There were logistics specialists, whose names we will never know, men who understood that armies do not move on courage alone but on ammunition, on fuel, on bread, on the ability to get wounded men to field hospitals in time. There were staff officers who had been trained at the same military schools where Vatutin had studied, men who shared his language of operational art, who could sit with him in these tents and debate the merits of one strategic approach against another, speaking in the spare technical language of military planning that to an outsider might sound almost abstract, divorced from the reality of death and suffering that it represented. Vatutin's reputation among these men was not that of a tyrant or a demigod, but rather something more subtle and perhaps more valuable in the long run. He was known as a careful listener. He would ask questions, and he would wait patiently for answers. When a staff officer made a suggestion, Vatutin would not immediately accept it or reject it, but would instead examine it, turn it over in his mind, as if it were a piece of machinery he wanted to understand completely. This habit of attention, this refusal to rush, came partly from temperament and partly from the hard lesson of the Great Terror, from the knowledge that hasty decisions could have consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate situation. In a state where many senior commanders were simply disappeared, where a wrong word spoken to the wrong person could end a career or a life, the ability to think clearly, to document one's reasoning, to act always with a kind of methodical deliberation, was not merely a virtue, but a form of survival. The tents themselves, though they sheltered from the worst of the weather, were never comfortable. In winter, the cold would penetrate the canvas in a way that no fire could entirely overcome. The men who worked in these headquarters would wear multiple layers of uniforms, would keep their hands tucked into pockets until the moment they needed to write or point to a map. There would be the thin sound of pencils scratching on paper, the rustle of maps being adjusted, the soft murmur of voices in conversation. Sometimes there would be longer stretches of silence, moments when Vatutin seemed to disappear into his own thoughts, his eyes fixed on a particular section of the map, his mind engaged in the invisible work of strategic calculation. What was he thinking about in these moments? Perhaps he was imagining the landscape from above, trying to see it as a pilot might, trying to understand the movement of armor and infantry as if he were orchestrating a vast, intricate piece of music. Perhaps he was considering the human cost of the plans he was making, the knowledge that every line drawn on a map represented orders that would result in casualties, in loss, in suffering that he would never directly witness, but for which he would carry responsibility. This is one of the loneliest aspects of command at the highest level, the knowledge that one's decisions ripple outward into human suffering in ways that are impossible to fully calculate or comprehend. The dispatches from the front would sometimes bring news that required immediate response. A German counterattack somewhere along the line, a breakthrough that had to be sealed, a unit that was running low on ammunition. Vatutin would respond with orders, but always with the sense that he was working with incomplete information, with a map that could never fully capture the reality of what was actually happening in the mud and snow of the battlefields. This gap between the map and the reality, between the carefully drawn lines and the chaos of actual combat, was something that every great commander had to learn to navigate. Vatutin had become exceptionally skilled at it. Between the moments of crisis were longer stretches of routine, of the slow work of planning the next offensive, of studying intelligence reports about German capabilities and intentions, of considering the logistical requirements for moving hundreds of thousands of men across distances that would have seemed unimaginable to previous generations of soldiers. In these quieter moments, there was sometimes time for reflection, for conversation, for the kind of human contact that made the work bearable. Officers would share stories, would discuss the latest news from Moscow, would speculate about how much longer the war might continue, though such speculation had to be careful and cautious, particularly in the early years when the outcome seemed anything but certain. The maps themselves tell a kind of story about Vatutin's mind. If we could somehow step back into one of these headquarters tents and look at the maps he studied, we might notice the kind of detail he attended to, the kinds of markings and annotations he favored, the way he chose to represent information. Some commanders prefer very simple maps, with just the essential information. Others want every possible detail included. Vatutin seems to have preferred something in between, maps that were comprehensive but not overwhelming, that presented the strategic situation in a way that made clear the options available, the constraints operating on his forces, the opportunities that might be seized if the timing and execution were precise. It was in these headquarters, surrounded by the careful work of planning and analysis, that Vatutin developed the reputation that would eventually bring him to the highest levels of Soviet military command. He was not a flamboyant figure, not a man who sought personal glory, or who cultivated relationships with politicians through charm or personal connections. Instead, he earned his reputation through the quality of his thinking, through the results that his commands achieved, and through the loyalty of the men who worked for him, officers who trusted that when they received an order from Vatutin, it had been carefully thought through, that it took into account the realities of the situation, and that he would do everything in his power to support them in its execution. This kind of trust, built slowly through consistent demonstration of competence and care, was perhaps more valuable than any formal promotion or official recognition, and it would sustain him through the years that lay ahead, carrying him toward his greatest victories and ultimately toward the circumstances that would define the end of his life. The winter of 1942 descended upon the southern Soviet front like a drawn breath held too long, cold and heavy, and laden with the possibility of transformation. In the frozen weeks that followed Stalingrad's surrender, when the German Sixth Army lay defeated in the rubble, and the Soviet forces could finally pause to count their losses and their unlikely victory, Nikolai Vatutin found himself at the fulcrum of the Red Army's next great movement. The salient around Stalingrad had become a staging ground, a place where men and machines regrouped, while snow fell softly on the steppe, muffling the groans of the wounded and the rumble of repair crews working through the darkness. The question that animated those early weeks of 1943 was deceptively simple, though its answer would reshape the entire face of the war in the East. With Stalingrad secured and German forces recoiling southwestward, where should Soviet momentum flow next? The map suggested many possibilities, but it was Vatutin's methodical mind, working within the machinery of the General Staff, that helped crystallize the strategy. The liberation of Kharkov became the obvious target, the great industrial city sitting like a prize waiting to be claimed, and Vatutin was dispatched southwestward to oversee the Voronezh Front's participation in what would become the Southwest Front's grand winter offensive. Picture, if the mind allows such vivid imaginings in the drifting darkness, the kind of landscape across which these campaigns unfolded. The Ukrainian steppe in winter reveals itself as something almost lunar, undulating plains of white beneath a sky of iron grey, punctuated by occasional patches of pine forest and the frozen threads of rivers. It was across this terrain that armoured columns began to move in late January, Soviet T-34 tanks in their massed formations, cavalry units on horseback, infantry trudging through snow that reached above their ankles. Vatutin rode near the front lines in a staff car, reviewing positions, adjusting orders that flowed from army headquarters to corps to divisional commanders in an endless cascade of tactical decisions. Each day brought new intelligence reports, new assessments of German movements, new calculations about where the next blow should fall. The liberation of Kharkov came in early February, the German garrison withdrawing before overwhelming Soviet pressure, and for a brief, almost dreamlike interval, the city seemed to have been finally reclaimed. Soviet engineers worked to restore communications, to repair the damaged infrastructure, to establish supply lines stretching back across the hundreds of kilometers to the rear. There was a feeling, reported by officers in their dispatches and implied in the tone of communications between army commanders, of momentum at last shifting decisively toward the Soviet side. The winter offensive had succeeded where so many previous operations had failed, and the front had been pushed west, deeper into German-held territory, closer toward the recovery of Soviet soil. Yet what Vatutin and the other senior commanders were beginning to understand, through careful study of German movements and through the reports of reconnaissance aircraft and intelligence officers, was that the German army was not truly defeated. It had simply retreated to new positions, to ground of its own choosing, and it was preparing something. The question that occupied Vatutin's waking hours, and perhaps intruded upon what little sleep he allowed himself, was whether the Germans were merely consolidating a defensive line or whether they were gathering strength for a counter-offensive of their own. History, in its quiet way, would soon provide an answer that neither side had fully anticipated. In early March, barely a month after the liberation of Kharkov, German armoured forces under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a powerful counter-offensive. This was no desperate, last throwing of diminished resources. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, involving fresh panzer divisions, reinforcements brought down from other sectors, and the kind of concentrated force that the German army, despite its losses at Stalingrad, could still marshal when circumstances allowed. The Soviet forces, stretched thin across the newly conquered terrain, lacking sufficient reserves and finding themselves overextended, began to give ground. Kharkov, that symbol of Soviet recovery, was lost again to German attack in the middle of March. The ebb and flow of this winter and early spring campaign imparted lessons that would prove invaluable in the months and years to come, and Vatutin was among those officers who absorbed these lessons most carefully. The first was perhaps the most sobering, that the German army, despite tremendous losses, retained the capacity to generate formidable offensive power and to execute complex maneuvers with precision. The second was more subtle, but no less important. Soviet offensives, if they lacked proper concentration of force and if they outran their supply lines, could be turned against themselves. Momentum alone, no matter how encouraging it seemed in the moment, could not substitute for careful planning, adequate reserves, and the steady accumulation of material strength. Vatutin's role in these retreats and recoveries was to learn, to observe, to internalize the patterns of mobile warfare on the vast eastern steppes. He was not yet a field commander wielding the sword, but rather a senior officer studying how that sword might best be used, working within the higher machinery of Soviet command to ensure that future operations would be better planned, better resourced, better coordinated. The Voronezh front, under his supervision, withdrew to new positions, stabilized the front, and prepared for the next phase of the war. Around him, other generals and senior officers were absorbing similar lessons, and the Red Army as a whole was moving through a period of painful but productive education in the art of large-scale warfare. By late spring, as the mud of the Rasputitsa, the season of bottomless roads, began to dry and the steppe emerged from winter's grip, both the Soviet and German armies found themselves preparing for something larger still. The Germans were concentrating massive forces for an operation they codenamed Citadel, an ambitious plan to pinch off a great Soviet salient and destroy the Soviet armies massed within it. The Soviets, through superior intelligence and through the kind of meticulous analysis that Vatutin had helped to pioneer within the General Staff, had divined something of German intentions. The winter campaigns, with their losses and their lessons, were merely prelude. The real test of what the Soviet army had learned was about to unfold across the rolling terrain around Kursk, in what would become one of the largest and most consequential battles in human history. The summer of 1943 arrived with a peculiar clarity across the Russian steppes. After the Soviet triumph at Stalingrad and the costly stalemate at Kharkov, both sides understood that somewhere in the vast landscape between Orel and Belgorod, the next great collision was gathering. The Germans called it Operation Citadel. The Soviets, with their gift for naming, called it the Battle of Kursk, and it would become, in some measures, the largest tank engagement in human history. Imagine, for a moment, the geological patience required in those early weeks of summer. Vatutin, now firmly established as commander of the Voronezh front, stood over maps in his headquarters, a place of canvas and lamplight and the soft rustle of papers, and recognized what the intelligence summaries were telling him. The Germans were massing, not retreating, as some in Moscow hoped, but gathering themselves for one more great offensive. The salient, that bulge of Soviet-held territory that jutted southward into German lines, would be the anvil upon which they meant to hammer. The preparation for Kursk was unlike anything Vatutin had orchestrated before. For weeks, nothing but work. The construction of defensive lines. Layers upon layers of them, not one line, but multiple echelons of trenches, anti-tank positions, minefields that would sprawl across hundreds of kilometers. The Soviet approach to defense, learned hard through 2 years of retreat and catastrophe, was methodical and geometrical. You did not merely hold a line. You created a fortress from the earth itself. Vatutin's sector, the north face of the salient, fell to him and his planners to fortify with absolute precision. What strikes one, in reading the accounts of those weeks before the battle erupted, is the almost aching slowness of it. Soldiers dug, engineers surveyed, commanders visited forward positions and stood silent, calculating sight lines and fields of fire. There was no noise of engines or artillery yet. The horror, for now, remained theoretical. Can you sense the peculiar tension of a quiet afternoon before the sky fractures? That was the mood across the Voronezh front in late June. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer by the day. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs of German concentrations. Captured prisoners and deserters whispered details of the coming assault. Shaposhnikov, the chief of staff, relayed messages from Stalin himself, who, for all his paranoia and impulsiveness in other domains, proved capable of a certain operational patience when it came to major defensive preparations. Trust your fortifications, the orders seemed to imply. Trust your anti-tank guns and your mines. Trust your reserves. Trust Vatutin. The 5th Guard Tank Army, under Pavel Rotmistrov, was positioned as Vatutin's operational reserve. It was a force designed not merely to absorb the German blow, but to deliver, in turn, a devastating counterattack. How many tanks constituted the 5th Guard? Estimates vary, but imagine 3,000 armored vehicles, arranged in formation across the steppe, crews in their turrets, engines running cold in the early morning, awaiting the signal to advance. The coordination of such a force required an almost musical precision. Vatutin and Rotmistrov had to understand each other without words. They had to anticipate how a battle might flow and where reserves might tip the balance. July 3, 1943, the German offensive began. In the north, the 4th Panzer Army under Colonel General Walter Model hurled itself against the Voronezh front's positions with a fury that suggested, for a moment, that the Germans might break through. The initial assault came in successive waves, Panzer IVs and Panthers and Tigers, moving through the smoke and dust in formations that Soviet gunners had been preparing to meet for weeks. The German soldiers, men who had conquered France and been bloodied at Stalingrad, attacked with a kind of desperate competence, knowing that this might be their last chance to seize the initiative in the east. Vatutin's defensive lines held. This is not to say they held without cost. Soldiers died, whole positions were overrun and then retaken, but the layers of defense that had been so carefully constructed, the minefields and anti-tank positions, the reserves positioned at precise points along the front, They functioned as Vatutin had envisioned. The Germans made gains, yes, but they did not break through. They did not achieve the rapid penetration that their operational doctrine required. And with each day of grinding combat, Vatutin's position strengthened. There is something almost meditative about reading accounts of defensive warfare from this perspective. A commander cannot will victory in the way that an attacking commander might. Instead, he must manage resources, ensure that orders are understood, position reserves where the crisis will inevitably emerge. Vatutin moved across the Voronezh front during those early days of combat, visiting command posts, listening to reports, nodding his understanding. What did he think about riding in his jeep across the dusty roads? Perhaps he was calculating probabilities. Perhaps he was reflecting on the thousands of men whose lives depended on decisions he had made weeks before, when the earth was still soft and the explosions had not yet begun. By the 5th of July, the pattern was becoming apparent. The Germans were making progress, but far more slowly than they had anticipated. The initial assault was losing momentum. In the north, Model was achieving only incremental gains. And in the south, where Army Group South under Erich von Manstein was pressing from the Belgorod direction, the situation was similar. The Germans had not accounted, in their calculations, for quite how thoroughly the Soviet defenses had been prepared. This is when Vatutin's operational thinking began to shift. The defense was succeeding, but success in defense, properly understood, is not the mere absence of defeat. It is the creation of conditions for counter-offense. The Soviets had learned this lesson at terrible cost over the preceding years. You absorb the enemy assault. You allow him to exhaust himself against your fortifications, and then, at the moment when his reserves are committed and his momentum has spent itself, you strike. The Voronezh front was poised to do precisely this. Rotmistrov's 5th Guard tank army, still largely uncommitted, waited in the shadows. Soviet reconnaissance identified the moment when German momentum was failing. Vatutin, working in coordination with Soviet High Command, made the decision. The counter-offensive would begin. The offensive phase of the Battle of Kursk was now emerging from the defensive preparation that had come before. What followed was a grinding, desperate series of engagements. The 5th Guard tank army launched its counterattack. The subsequent tank battles, fields filled with smoke, explosions, the screams of damaged metal, produced some of the largest armor clashes of the war. Was the Battle of Prokhorovka, that famous encounter, the largest tank battle in history, as legend has it? Historians continue to debate the details. The Soviet accounts, written immediately after the war, suggested a certain narrative clarity that may not have reflected the confused reality of those hours. But what is not in doubt is that massive forces clashed, that Vatutin's command coordinated the movements of hundreds of thousands of men across a frontage of hundreds of kilometers, and that the German offensive was, ultimately, turned back. By the middle of July, the trajectory was becoming unavoidable. The Germans, despite their tactical skill and the quality of their armor, could not achieve the breakthrough that Operation Citadel demanded. They were fighting against not merely the strength of Soviet defenses, but against time itself. Every day of fighting in the Kursk salient was a day that Soviet reserves were being brought to bear, that Soviet forces in other sectors were preparing offensives of their own. The Soviet strategy, if we step back and view it in its entirety, was one of absorbing the German assault and then, through coordinated offensives along multiple fronts, beginning the great westward push that would not cease until German forces were driven back to Berlin. Vatutin's role in this immense drama was, in some ways, a quiet one. He was not winning battles through some moment of tactical inspiration. Instead, he was executing a carefully conceived defensive plan, and then, when the moment came, unleashing the counter-offensive with precision. This was the kind of command that Soviet military doctrine, particularly as it had evolved under Shaposhnikov's influence, valued. Not the romantic cavalry general of Napoleonic legend, but the scientific commander. The officer who understood the movement of masses, the coordination of complex operations, the allocation of resources across a vast front. As July turned into August, the Battle of Kursk was transforming into something larger. It was becoming the opening move of the Soviet summer offensive of 1943. The Voronezh front was now pushing westward, following up on the failure of the German assault. Vatutin's forces advanced through the same territory they had defended so grimly weeks before. German lines, which had seemed so formidable in early July, were now collapsing. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, and Vatutin, the studious officer from Chepokino village, who had risen through the ranks during the terror and the chaos of the early war, was now one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated commanders. The significance of Kursk extended beyond the mere military outcome. It was the moment when Soviet strategic initiative became absolute. The German army, after 2 years of offensive operations in the east, was no longer capable of dictating the terms of engagement. From this point forward, Soviet strategy would determine the rhythm of operations. And Vatutin, commanding the Voronezh front, would be one of the instruments through which that strategy was executed. By the autumn of 1943, something had shifted in the rhythm of the war, and in the fortunes of Nikolai Vatutin himself. The immediate panic of survival had given way to something more deliberate, more expansive. The Germans, for all their remaining strength, were no longer the force that had nearly broken the Soviet Union. They were wounded, retreating, stretched across a continent they could no longer hold, and the Voronezh front, under Vatutin's steady hand, had begun to move not merely to defend, but to liberate, to advance, to reclaim. The autumn rains had turned the steppes to mud. Roads became rivers of thick, sucking earth that slowed trucks, tanks, and men alike. Yet it was precisely in these conditions, when logistics became as much a test as tactics, that Vatutin's methodical mind seemed to find its fullest expression. He was a general who understood that victory was not always won by the boldest stroke, but by the accumulation of small advantages, careful management, and an almost meditative patience with the machines of war and the men who operated them. By October, the Voronezh front had begun its offensive toward the Dnieper River, one of the great natural barriers of Eastern Europe. The Germans, falling back in stages, had prepared defensive positions along the western bank, but Vatutin, working closely now with other front commanders and with the general staff in Moscow, saw an opportunity that required not raw aggression, but calculation. He orchestrated a series of linked operations, hammer blows delivered at points where the enemy was thin, then rapid exploitation before the enemy could consolidate. The crossing of the Dnieper in October and November of 1943 was not a single apocalyptic moment, but a succession of brutal, methodical engagements. Soviet engineers would scout the banks at night, find weaknesses in the German lines, and then small assault groups would slip across in boats or rafts, establishing tiny bridgeheads on the far shore. Once a foothold was secured, more men would follow, then vehicles, then supplies. It was the way of modern warfare in those years, not Napoleon sweeping across continents, but careful, grinding progress, paid for in blood, but measured in kilometers. Vatutin coordinated these operations from his headquarters, reading reports through the long hours, understanding not just what his own troops were doing, but what the enemy was forced to do in response. Kiev itself, the ancient capital of the Ukrainian lands, lay somewhere to the south and west, a glittering prize that had been lost to the Germans in 1941 and remained in their hands through all the subsequent years of struggle. It was a symbol, not only a strategic objective, not only a city of industrial and logistical importance, but a symbol of what the Soviet Union claimed to be reclaiming, retaking, redeeming. And as autumn deepened toward winter, the Voronezh front moved closer to it. The approach to Kiev required Vatutin to manage an increasingly complex operation. He was now operating in coordination with other fronts, with flanking movements, with intelligence gathered from partisan networks in the Ukrainian countryside. The Germans had fortified the region extensively, preparing a series of defensive lines that they believed could hold indefinitely. But Vatutin, once again, saw the subtle gaps, the places where the enemy was too thin, the directions from which an assault might achieve surprise. He began to concentrate his forces methodically, drawing in reserves, positioning his armor and his fresh rifle divisions for a concentrated blow. By early November, the offensive came. Vatutin threw the Voronezh front forward in a series of coordinated attacks that seemed, from the perspective of the German High Command, to come from multiple directions at once. In truth, they came from one general who understood how to create the illusion of overwhelming force by attacking where the enemy was weakest and then sustaining the momentum through relentless follow-through. The German lines, weakened by months of withdrawal and bleeding, began to shatter. On the 6th of November 1943, Soviet troops liberated Kiev, not slowly, not reluctantly, but in a surge of red flags and triumphant soldiers moving through streets that had endured nearly 3 years of Nazi occupation. The city was damaged, certainly. Much of it had been destroyed, either by the Germans in their withdrawal or by the Soviets in their assault. But it was Soviet again, or rather, it was Soviet once more, claimed back from the invader. And in Moscow, in the Kremlin, the news of Kiev's liberation rippled through the halls of power with immense significance. It was more than a military victory, it was a statement. The tide had truly turned. The Red Army was not merely defending the Soviet homeland anymore. It was the instrument of Soviet reconquest, of Soviet recovery, of the restoration of Stalin's empire over all the territories the Germans had seized. And at the center of this achievement, coordinating the assaults, managing the logistics, making the crucial decisions that turned possibility into reality, was Nikolai Vatutin. His reputation, which had been quietly growing through Kursk and through the grinding operations of the past months, now began to assume a different character entirely. He was no longer simply a capable staff officer who had been thrust into command. He was a front commander of genuine stature, a man whom other generals respected, whom the general staff trusted with major strategic operations, and whom Stalin himself had begun to notice in a way that suggested approval. In the Byzantine atmosphere of Soviet military politics, such notice could be as dangerous as it was flattering. But in the late autumn of 1943, as the autumn rains gave way to the first hard frosts of winter, Vatutin seemed to embody something that even Stalin wanted to see: a general who could win, who could plan, who could achieve. The liberation of Kiev was followed by further advances. The Voronezh front continued westward, crossing into Ukrainian territory that had been under German occupation for years. Villages were liberated. Populations that had endured occupation and atrocity were freed. The momentum of victory, once it begins to build, tends to acquire its own weight, its own inevitability. Soviet troops pushed forward, their supplies stretched longer and longer behind them, but the enemy before them was weakening, falling back toward the borders of Poland and Romania. It was a time of extraordinary achievement for Vatutin. He had participated in the greatest turning points of the war, from the defense at Stalingrad, to the vast struggle at Kursk, to the liberation of one of the great cities of Eastern Europe. He was honored, promoted, given control of increasingly important operations. The ideological machinery of the Soviet state began to celebrate him, to write about him, to present him to the public as an example of Soviet military excellence. Yet there is something worth noting, something gentle to consider as one contemplates this moment of his ascendancy. Vatutin was a man of the general staff, a planner, a cautious and methodical officer. He was not a charismatic figure like some other Soviet generals. He was not a man who courted publicity or sought to build a personal following among his troops. He worked best when he was working with maps and reports, when he was coordinating operations across vast distances, when he was thinking several moves ahead of the present moment. In the hierarchy of Stalin's military court, such qualities had both advantages and vulnerabilities. Advantages because they made him useful, indispensable even. Vulnerabilities because they left him less protected by personal loyalty, less able to maneuver in the realm of political symbolism that mattered so deeply in the Soviet system. The autumn of 1943 saw Vatutin at the zenith of his military achievement, and perhaps also at a threshold beyond which his fate would begin to turn in ways that no amount of military competence could prevent. Yet there exists another war within the war, one that moves through forests and villages with a different logic entirely, one that operates according to rhythms older than ideology itself. As Vatutin commanded his front across open steppe and through the rubble of recaptured cities, something far more intricate was unfolding in the lands to his west. The Ukrainian countryside, particularly the western provinces that had belonged to Poland between the wars, harbored loyalties and grievances that did not align neatly with Soviet victory or German defeat. Here, in the borderlands, where empires had contested for centuries, a shadow conflict burned with its own particular intensity. The Ukrainian insurgent army, known by its Ukrainian initials as the UPA, had begun to coalesce in the early 1940s, drawing strength from Ukrainian nationalists who saw in the war's chaos an opportunity to stake a claim for independence, or at minimum autonomy, from Soviet rule. These were not organized military formations in the conventional sense, though they would grow to command tens of thousands of armed men. They were born instead from cells, from networks of young men and women who had nursed dreams of Ukrainian sovereignty through the interwar years, through the Soviet collectivization horrors of the early 1930s, through the Great Terror that had decimated Ukrainian intellectual and military elites. When Germany invaded in 1941, some Ukrainian nationalists initially saw the Nazi advance as a potential ally against Soviet domination, though that calculation would prove tragically naive. By 1943 and 1944, as Soviet forces began their relentless westward push, the UPA found themselves caught between two empires, each equally hostile to Ukrainian independence. The western Ukrainian countryside where these insurgents operated was a land of complexity and pain. Villages nestled among pine forests and rolling hills, separated from one another by vast stretches of woodland and swamp. These communities had lived through occupation and reoccupation, through forced collectivization, through the deportations that had thinned their populations. Families had been torn apart by ideological demands and by simple survival. Peasants understood, in their bones, that whoever won this war would rule them, and that neither Stalin nor Hitler had promised them freedom. Within this landscape, the UPA recruited not from abstract ideology, but from a deep well of resentment and from the most primal of human impulses, the desire to defend one's homeland against foreign rule. What made the UPA's struggle particularly tragic, and what would eventually intersect with Vatutin's own fate, was the profound fracturing of loyalties in this region. Not all Ukrainians supported the nationalists. Many had joined the Soviet army or the partisan movements fighting Germans. Some collaborated with the Nazis out of pragmatism or ideology. Others simply tried to survive, tending their fields and protecting their families from all armed forces equally. The UPA, in turn, were willing to use violence against those they perceived as enemies of Ukrainian independence, which included not only Germans and Soviets, but also Ukrainians who refused to join their cause or who supported Soviet rule. This created a vicious cycle of ambush and reprisal that would stain the forests and villages of western Ukraine throughout the war and for years after it. Consider the position of a young man in, say, the Rovno region, or the forests near Volhynia in the winter of 1943. He might have lost relatives to Soviet purges years earlier. He might have had cousins killed in German labor camps. The Red Army was advancing, yes, but Soviet rule meant collectivization, meant political officers, meant the subordination of all Ukrainian aspirations to Moscow's will. The UPA recruiters came to such villages with guns and with promises, with arguments that appealed to every resentment and wound. To refuse was dangerous. To accept was to choose a side in a conflict that offered no true victory to anyone. The geography itself encouraged the UPA's persistence. The forests of western Ukraine, particularly the vast woodlands of Volhynia and eastern Galicia, provided natural sanctuaries for guerrilla operations. Dense stands of pine and birch, swamps and ravines, interconnected by narrow paths known to locals for generations. A partisan band could move through this terrain without being seen for hours, could melt away when Soviet forces approached, could emerge from another direction entirely. Supply lines could be improvised from village sympathizers or from captured German stocks. The terrain had shaped military strategy in this region for centuries, and the UPA understood it as intimately as the forests understood them. What is perhaps most striking about this parallel conflict is how little it was publicized in the official Soviet narrative. Even as Vatutin and other generals received increasing acclaim for their victories, even as Soviet propaganda celebrated the liberation of Ukrainian cities and the destruction of German forces, the war against Ukrainian nationalists continued, with a kind of grim persistence that authorities preferred not to highlight. For how does one celebrate the liberation of Ukraine when Ukrainians themselves are refusing to be liberated into Soviet rule? How does one maintain the fiction of a united Soviet people when entire regions are being contested by armed insurgents who claim to represent Ukrainian interests? The contradiction was too great to acknowledge openly, and so the UPA were typically described in Soviet communications as German collaborators or as bandits, terms that obscured the genuine nationalist motivation and the genuine popular support they commanded among certain sectors of the rural population. Yet it would be a mistake to romanticize the UPA as purely noble freedom fighters. Like all armed movements born from desperation and shaped by violence, they committed acts of terrible brutality. They conducted massacres against populations they deemed disloyal or hostile. They engaged in ethnic violence against Polish and Jewish communities in the disputed territories, particularly in the chaotic years of 1943 and 1944. They were capable of extraordinary cruelty against Soviet officials and collaborators. They were a force shaped by the moral dissolution that total war brings to every nation and every cause, and their methods could be as ruthless as those of any state army. By the time Vatutin's forces were pressing deep into Ukrainian territory in early 1944, taking city after city and stabilizing Soviet control across the region, the UPA represented both a security threat that could not be ignored and a political complication that could not be easily resolved. They were present in the forests and villages through which Soviet supply lines moved. They had the capability to strike at Soviet officers and soldiers, to disrupt communications, to kill even high-ranking commanders. They represented the future conflict that would consume Soviet energies in Ukraine for years to come, a hidden war that would not end with Germany's defeat, but would instead intensify and persist into the 1950s. In the snow-covered countryside west of Kiev, east of the Bug River, in the farmland and forests that now fell under Soviet control, the UPA watched and waited and planned. They understood that their war was not yet finished, that the departure of German forces created not peace, but rather a transition to a new kind of struggle, They had sympathizers in villages, informants who could track the movements of Soviet commanders, networks that extended even into the headquarters of Soviet forces. And it was in this landscape of fractured loyalties and unresolved conflict that Nikolai Vatutin, one of the architects of Soviet military victory, would soon find himself uniquely vulnerable. The very ground he commanded harbored forces that had no reason to wish him well, forces that had learned to see in his presence not the face of liberation, but the face of occupation. The road from Kiev to Rovno was frozen that late February morning, the kind of cold that seemed to draw all color from the world and leave only white, grey, and the deep black of stands of pine pressing close against the asphalt. Nikolai Vatutin sat in the back of his command car, a Packard that had seen better days, reviewing papers in the dim light that filtered through frosted windows. It was the 29th of February 1944, a date that would hold almost no meaning to most people who lived through that war, and yet it would become the pivot on which his entire destiny turned, the moment when the careful architecture of his achievement began its slow, irreversible collapse. He had been traveling from the headquarters of the First Ukrainian Front, moving through the liberated territories west of Kiev, territories still warm with the flush of recent Soviet conquest. The Germans had been pushed back, and the Red Army was consolidating its control over the region, but the zone behind the front lines remained dangerous in ways that were not always visible to the eye. The woods held partisans and guerrillas of many kinds, some answering to Moscow, some to Warsaw, some to the Ukrainian nationalist underground, and some to no one but themselves, and the old hungers for power and vengeance that the war had set loose across the continent like a plague. Vatutin was traveling light, or as light as a general commanding millions of men might travel. There were perhaps a dozen soldiers with him, officers and aides, their vehicles moving through the landscape with a rhythm that had grown almost routine. This was Soviet territory now, or so it was believed. The front had rolled westward. The immediate danger of the German panzers seemed to belong to the receding past, and yet danger of an entirely different kind was moving through those same frozen forests, patient and implacable as hunger. The ambush came without warning, which perhaps is the only way an ambush ever truly comes. Gunfire erupted from the roadside, sudden and focused, the kind of concentrated fire that suggested planning and knowledge. The command car shuddered under the impact of bullets. There was shouting, the sound of return fire, the noise and confusion that always attends the first moments of violence. And then, almost as quickly as it had erupted, the attack seemed to break apart, the attackers melting back into the forest with the efficiency of men who had done this before and knew exactly when to withdraw. Vatutin had been hit. A bullet, or perhaps more than one, accounts would later differ on this point, had struck him in the abdomen. The wound was severe, the kind that carries immediately the knowledge of grave danger, though perhaps not yet the certainty of death. He was bleeding heavily, and there was the peculiar, urgent calm that descends when a man realizes that his body has suddenly become an unreliable instrument, that the machinery of his life is failing in ways he cannot control. There was a confusion of moments then, a blur of motion and hands and voices speaking urgently into radios. Vatutin was placed in one of the vehicles, and the small convoy turned away from Rovno, away from the front lines, toward the nearest Soviet medical facility. His adjutants and officers surrounded him, trying to staunch the bleeding with whatever cloth they could find, their faces reflecting the peculiar mixture of shock and determination that surfaces when a man who has commanded thousands suddenly becomes simply a wounded person requiring help to survive the next hour. The journey to the field hospital was perhaps the first of many ironies that would accumulate around Vatutin's death like snow around a stone. He was a general in the Red Army at its moment of supreme confidence and power, and yet in those hours he was entirely dependent on the skills of Soviet surgeons working in a medical tent with limited equipment and the constant sound of the front still audible in the distance. The surgery was performed, the wound was dressed as well as wartime medicine allowed, and for a moment it seemed possible that he might recover. Vatutin was strong, his constitution seemingly robust, and there was the stubborn will to live that often accompanies men who have spent their entire lives in command, used to commanding their own bodies if nothing else. But infection set in. This was the great enemy of the wounded in 1944, the invisible force that moved through bandages and sutures and surgical incisions with terrible patience. Vatutin developed a fever. The fever rose. The doctors worked with what they had, which was never quite enough, never quite right. The penicillin scarce and not always effective. The antibiotics of modern medicine still years away from the Soviet pharmacopoeia. The fever rose higher. What happened in those weeks between the ambush and Vatutin's death was wrapped in a peculiar silence, the kind of silence that only the Soviet system could produce. Information was carefully controlled. Vatutin's condition was not made public in any detailed way. There were official statements, certainly, communiques about the health of the general, but they conveyed little truth, or at least they conveyed only as much truth as the Soviet leadership deemed appropriate for public consumption. Around him, in the headquarters and among the officers of the military, there was a growing awareness that something was deeply wrong, that the general was not recovering as he should, that the infection was spreading despite every effort to contain it. There is something particularly poignant about a man who has spent his entire career planning operations, moving pieces across maps, sending hundreds of thousands into harm's way, and who now finds himself in a position where all the planning in the world cannot help him. Vatutin could not plan his way out of infection. He could not issue orders that would make his body obey. The infection moved through his system with its own logic, indifferent to his rank, to his achievements, to the love his men bore him, or to any of the elaborate structures of command and authority that had been built around him for decades. And perhaps more troubling still was the question that had begun to emerge in the minds of those around him, and in his own mind as well. Who had fired those shots? The attack had been precise, focused, the work of men who seemed to know something about Vatutin's movements, about his route, about the fact that he would be traveling that road on that day. The Germans were the obvious suspects, but the more that was learned about the ambush, the less clear this became. There were persistent rumors, whispers that moved through the Ukrainian territories like wind, that it had been Ukrainian nationalists, members of the UPA who sought to strike at the Soviet leadership, to strike at anyone who represented Soviet control over lands that they believed belonged to Ukraine. There were other theories, darker theories perhaps, though these were never spoken aloud and would have been dangerous to speak aloud. Theories that involved political rivals, struggles within the Soviet command, the ever-present possibility that in Stalin's Red Army, the most dangerous enemy was not always the one wearing a German uniform. But Vatutin, lying in that hospital bed, burning with fever and dying by degrees of an infection that no amount of medical skill could fully defeat, could not concern himself overmuch with such questions. What consumed him, and what consumed those around him, was the immediate, terrible reality of his declining condition, the slow realization that the man who had planned the liberation of Kiev, who had commanded the Voronezh front at Kursk, who had been decorated and honored and elevated to the highest ranks of the Soviet military, was going to die in a hospital bed in a provincial Soviet town, his end hastened by an infection that began in a wound inflicted by persons unknown. As the weeks passed and the fever did not abate, as his strength continued to ebb, the silence around Vatutin's condition grew deeper and more profound. It was the silence of a state that did not know quite what to make of the death of one of its most successful generals. It was the silence of uncertainty, of competing narratives, of the question of whether this was an assassination or an accident, whether it was a tragedy or a consequence of the choices that had been made in the hard years of the war. The weeks that followed the ambush near Miliatin were a slow descent. Infection set in, the kind that antibiotics of that era could barely touch, spreading through tissue and bone with a methodical cruelty that no amount of surgical skill could arrest. Vatutin lay in a hospital bed in Moscow, his powerful frame diminishing day by day, and those who visited him, and there were very few, which itself told a story, reported a man still sharp in mind, but watching his own body betray him, with the stoicism of a soldier who had seen too much to be surprised by suffering. The infection took his arm's full function first, then his strength, then finally, on the 28th of April in 1944, his life. He was 43 years old, just 43. The death of a Soviet marshal should have been a moment of national reckoning, should have been, but instead there fell a peculiar silence. Not a respectful silence, but something more complicated, a silence born of uncertainty, of political caution, of the unspoken understanding that sometimes the truth surrounding a death matter less than the stories one chooses to tell about it. What happened next was the state funeral, held in Kiev rather than Moscow, which itself was significant. Kiev was where Vatutin's triumphs had been most recent, where he had liberated the city and restored it to Soviet hands just months before his death. The city streets were lined with soldiers in their winter dress uniforms, their breath visible in the cool spring air. Thousands gathered, subordinates he had commanded, colleagues from the general staff, party officials who understood the weight of the moment. The funeral was grand, the kind of grand that only the Soviet Union could manage. But it was also curiously empty of the words one might have expected. There were no lengthy eulogies passing his genius or his contributions, no detailed recounting of his strategic innovations or his role in the great victories of the war. Instead, what emerged was a kind of civic commemoration, respectful, but thin, as if the state was honoring him without quite examining why. In the months and years that followed, monuments were erected. A modest obelisk was placed near the site of his birth in Chepukino. Streets in Kiev and Moscow took his name. Military academies offered his memory in their ceremonies. The Soviet war history books, when they addressed his campaigns, did so with appropriate praise. But even as these monuments rose, even as his name appeared in official histories, there persisted an odd quality of erasure. Not obliteration, that would have been more honest, in a strange way, but something like gentle forgetting, as if the Soviet state had decided that Vatutin was to be remembered without quite being discussed. The question of who killed him, and why, would never be settled with absolute certainty. The official narrative held firm. Ukrainian nationalist partisans of the UPA, engaged in their desperate insurgency against Soviet rule, had identified a high-ranking Soviet officer traveling on a dangerous road and struck at him. This was true in its basic facts. The ambush happened. It was likely orchestrated by nationalist forces. But as the decades passed and Soviet archives began to yield their secrets, whispers emerged from the historical margins. Some who studied the incident, particularly in later years when such examination became possible, suggested the presence of complications. Could elements of Soviet security have been indifferent to the general's movement? Could there have been internal rivals who benefited from his removal? Could the UPA attack have been, in some measure, permitted to happen? These were questions that could never be proven in any conventional sense, but they existed, suspended in the space between documentation and speculation, the way such questions always do. What is known with certainty is that Vatutin died at a moment of profound political transition. Stalin was consolidating power further, the war was beginning to turn decisively in the Soviet favor, and the General Staff was undergoing its own subtle restructuring. Vatutin, brilliant though he was also a man of a certain moment, and perhaps that moment had begun to pass. The genius of his strategic insight had been in seeing the wider patterns of warfare, in understanding logistics and pincers and the mathematics of encirclement. But as the war entered its final phase, the qualities required of Soviet commanders began to shift. The need for bold innovation gave way to the need for reliable loyalty. The frontline general who could improvise and perceive gave way to the staff officer who could execute commands without question. And so Vatutin's death, in this reading, becomes a kind of hinge in history. Not because it was orchestrated, we cannot say that with confidence, but because it marked the moment when one type of Soviet military leadership was being subtly retired and another was emerging. His funeral was grand, yes, but it was also performative, a state ceremony that honored him without truly engaging with what he had meant, or what he might have become had the ambush never happened. The monuments remain, weathered and sometimes forgotten by those who pass them. The streets still bear his name. Military historians still study his campaigns with genuine respect, for his tactical and strategic insights were real and enduring. But there is something about the way history remembers him, something at once prominent and obscure, that mirrors the complexity of his death itself. He was killed by enemies, or perhaps by the indifference of the state he served, or perhaps by the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place at the moment when history was turning. We may never know, and perhaps that uncertainty, that fog, is itself the most fitting monument to a man whose life was spent navigating the shadows of Soviet power. In the spring of 1944, as the snow melted into rivers across Ukraine, a nation grieved a man few would remember with certainty. Nikolai Alexandrovich Vatutin lay in a Kiev cemetery, and within weeks, the machinery of Soviet power had already begun its slow work of forgetting. Not erasure. The Soviet state was careful never to erase entirely, but a kind of deliberate dimming, as though someone had drawn a curtain across a window through which the light had begun to fade. What becomes of a general when the war continues without him? When his voice no longer echoes through headquarters tents? When the maps he studied are rolled away and passed to other hands? Vatutin had spent his life in the margins of visibility, a planner, a staff officer, a steadying presence behind the thunder of guns. He had not sought glory in the way that some commanders do. His ambition was quieter, more architectural, to build something that lasted, something that held its shape under pressure. And in that quiet way, he had become indispensable, until, in the fog of an uncertain morning on a Ukrainian road, indispensability meant nothing at all. The question of who killed Vatutin has never fully settled in the historical record. It remains suspended, like a flake of snow that refuses to fall. The Soviet authorities blamed Ukrainian nationalist fighters, the UPA, those ghost armies of the forest. There is truth in this. The UPA did operate in those regions, did ambush Soviet officers. But was it truly the UPA that morning? Or was it someone else? Someone whose identity served other purposes? The records are incomplete. The testimonies conflict. Those who might have known have long since passed into their own silence, and the truth, if it ever lived cleanly in anyone's memory, has become something else entirely. A story, a version, an echo of what might have been. This is what time does to history when the stakes are high and the survivors are few. It does not merely fade, it fragments. It becomes layered with intention and fear. It becomes a mirror that each person who encounters it sees themselves reflected in, perhaps seeing what they need to see rather than what truly occurred. Vatutin's death entered the realm of legend almost immediately, not because what happened was unclear, but because clarity was dangerous. For the Soviet state to acknowledge certain things about Vatutin's end, to admit certain vulnerabilities, certain divisions, certain bitter truths about the nature of power and loyalty in a vast and wounded empire, would be to unravel threads that were better left knotted. Consider what Vatutin had been. A son of rural Russia, yes, but more than that, a servant of an enormous chaotic machine that demanded loyalty and offered only survival in return. He had navigated the purges, watched friends and colleagues disappear into the night, and never allowed himself to break. He had remained useful, he had remained steadfast, and in the end, what did it buy him? A wound in an ambush, an infection that spread through his body like rust through old iron, a slow, painful decline, an early grave. There is a particular kind of tragedy that attends the death of a man like this, not the grand tragedy of